Do you remember when you were younger and life was simpler? When the worst thing that could happen during a sleepover was your mate's mum finding the magazines you'd hidden under the mattress, or getting caught sneaking downstairs to watch something you weren't supposed to see on late-night television? Those innocent transgressions feel almost quaint now, knowing what I know about what some people actually watch when the lights go out. I was 23 when it happened, working as a trainee accountant in Birmingham and living in a shared house with 3 other guys. There was nothing glamorous about any of it. We split the bills 4 ways, took turns buying toilet roll, and spent most evenings playing games or arguing about whose turn it was to clean the kitchen. The sort of mundane existence that millions of people live without anything particularly interesting ever happening to them. My housemate Jake had always been the tech-savvy one among us. Not in a professional way, just the kind of person who knew how to fix your laptop when it started running slowly, or how to stream films that weren't available on Netflix yet. He'd spend hours on forums discussing privacy software and online security, the sort of conversations that made the rest of us glaze over and reach for our phones. The change in his behavior started gradually. He'd always been a bit antisocial, preferring his computer to actual human interaction. But this was different. He stopped joining us for meals, barely acknowledged us when we passed in the hallway, and we'd hear him moving around his room at strange hours. 2 in the morning, 4, sometimes just before dawn. Something about the way he looked at us changed too. Like he was seeing us differently, evaluating us in a way that made casual conversation feel uncomfortable. The sounds were what first made me properly notice something was off. Not just the usual keyboard clicking and mouse movements you'd expect from someone browsing the internet, but irregular patterns, long periods of complete silence, then sudden bursts of activity. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like muffled conversations, though we never saw anyone visiting his room. I mentioned it to the others, but they weren't particularly concerned. University houses are always full of odd noises and strange schedules. Still, we found ourselves unconsciously avoiding his part of the house, taking longer routes to the kitchen or bathroom to avoid walking past his door. None of us talked about it explicitly, but there was a shared sense that something felt off about being near his space. The first real warning sign came when I bumped into him in the kitchen one morning around 6. He looked terrible, pale, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept properly in days. When I asked if he was all right, he just stared at me for several seconds before mumbling something about work stress and disappearing back upstairs. Work stress seemed unlikely, given that he worked part-time at a local computer repair shop and had never shown any particular ambition or pressure about his career. But people deal with things differently, and it wasn't really my place to pry into his personal problems. We weren't close friends, just housemates sharing expenses and common areas. The electricity bills started arriving higher than usual around the same time. Not dramatically higher, but enough for us to notice when we were splitting costs 4 ways. When we asked about it, he claimed his computer had been running more intensive software for some freelance projects. Again, nothing that seemed worth arguing about, though it did add to the general sense that something had changed. His room began to smell different as well. Not unpleasant exactly, but stale and closed off, like air that hadn't been properly circulated for weeks. The few times his door was open when I passed, I caught glimpses of thick sheets hung over the windows and the glow of screens arranged at odd angles, creating shadows that seemed deliberately designed to obscure what was actually happening in there. There were cables everywhere, trailing across the floor in patterns that suggested something more complex than a simple computer setup. We started hearing voices from his room more regularly, always muffled, always unclear, but definitely not just him. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people talking at once. Other times, like single voices giving instructions or making requests. The conversations never seemed to follow normal patterns. No back and forth exchanges, no laughter. Just these odd, disjointed fragments of speech. The internet connection throughout the house became increasingly unreliable. Pages would load slowly. Streaming services would buffer constantly. And online games would lag to the point of being unplayable. When we complained to our internet provider, they insisted nothing was wrong with the connection, but the problems persisted. It felt like someone was using enormous amounts of bandwidth for something. I started paying more attention to his routine, not out of any particular suspicion, but because his behavior was affecting the rest of us. He'd leave his room only during specific hours, usually when the rest of us were out or asleep. The timing seemed deliberate, like he was actively avoiding contact with anyone else in the house. The packages started arriving more frequently as well, small, unmarked deliveries that he'd collect immediately and take straight to his room. When I asked the postman about them one day, he mentioned that our address was receiving more packages than most houses on the street, but couldn't tell me anything specific about the contents or senders. One evening, while he was out at his regular job, I heard sounds coming from his room. Not possible, obviously, since he wasn't home, but definitely something electronic, beeping, clicking, the sort of noises computers make when they're processing information or receiving data. The sounds continued for several hours, stopping only when I heard his key in the front door. The breaking point came during a particularly hot week in July. The house felt stifling, and we'd been leaving windows open to try to get some air circulation. I was in the garden that evening when I heard voices drifting down from his window, clear enough to make out actual words for the first time. Someone was giving directions, not navigation directions, but instructions about movements, positions, actions. The voice was calm and methodical, like someone reading from a script or manual. I couldn't make out the responses, but there were definitely other people involved in whatever was happening up there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of any immediate fear, but because something about the whole situation felt fundamentally wrong. The secretive behavior, the strange hours, the elaborate computer setup, the voices giving instructions. It all added up to something that went beyond normal antisocial behavior or work stress. I started researching online communities and activities that might explain what he was involved in. What I found made my stomach turn. There were references to hidden networks where people gathered for activities that operated outside normal boundaries, places where the worst impulses could be indulged without consequence. The descriptions were vague but deeply disturbing, suggesting interactive experiences where viewers could influence what happened to real people in real time. The realization that I might be living directly below someone participating in these networks was genuinely terrifying. The one-way conversations I'd overheard, the packages, the secretive behavior, it all suddenly made horrible sense. He wasn't just watching something disturbing. He was actively participating, making requests that were being carried out somewhere else, to someone else. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there could be innocent explanations for everything I'd observed. But the combination of evidence was too strong to ignore, and the descriptions I'd found online matched his behavior too precisely to be coincidental. Sleep became almost impossible. Every sound from his room took on sinister significance. Every conversation I overheard seemed to confirm my worst suspicions. I'd lie awake wondering what exactly was happening above me, who might be suffering because of activities being coordinated from our house. the knowledge that these networks existed, that people participated in them from ordinary houses in ordinary neighborhoods, fundamentally changed how I saw the world around me. Every house could be hiding similar activities. Every antisocial neighbor could be involved in things that shouldn't be possible in civilized society. I started noticing details about other houses on our street that I'd never paid attention to before. Which ones had unusual amounts of electronic equipment? Which residents kept irregular hours? Which properties received frequent deliveries or had visitors at strange times? The suburban normality that had always felt safe and predictable now seemed like a facade hiding darker realities. The authorities seemed completely unaware of what was happening. Police patrols continued their regular routes, completely oblivious to the networks operating parallel to their understanding of crime and disorder. The gap between official awareness and actual activity was enormous, leaving people like me with knowledge we couldn't act upon and evidence we couldn't report. I considered moving out, but that felt like abandoning responsibility for what I'd discovered. If these activities were happening in our house, involving our internet connection and our address, then walking away would make me complicit in whatever harm was being caused. But staying meant living with knowledge that was eating away at my ability to function normally. The situation resolved itself when he disappeared. Or that's what we told ourselves. The truth is, we're not entirely sure what happened. His presence in the house became increasingly sporadic, then stopped entirely. But none of us could pinpoint exactly when we'd last seen him. One day, we realized his room had been silent for over a week, and when we finally worked up the courage to check, it was empty. But the emptiness felt wrong somehow. His belongings were gone, but selectively. Personal items had vanished while leaving behind things that suggested a hurried departure. The room had been cleaned, but not thoroughly, as if someone had tried to remove evidence rather than simply tidy up. Most disturbing were the scratches on the walls near the window, thin marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. The house felt different after he left, not just quieter or less crowded, but somehow cleaner, like a source of contamination had been removed. The internet connection returned to normal. The electricity bills dropped back to reasonable levels, and the strange packages stopped arriving. Life returned to the mundane routine that had existed before. But the knowledge remained. Understanding that these networks exist, that ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty, that such activities happen in normal houses, in normal neighborhoods. The innocent world I'd lived in before had been permanently damaged by what I'd learned. Sometimes I wonder if he moved to another house with other unsuspecting housemates, or if the activities I'd witnessed were part of a larger network that continues to operate from locations across the country. The infrastructure exists, the participants are out there, and the demand for such content apparently continues to grow. I still live in shared houses, still split bills and argue about cleaning rotas and wonder about my housemates' odd behaviors. But now I pay attention to different details, notice different patterns, and ask different questions about the sounds that come from other people's rooms after midnight. It's funny how sometimes the most terrifying discoveries happen by complete accident. You're looking for something harmless, maybe trying to solve a simple problem, and you stumble across something that changes your entire understanding of the world around you. That's what happened to me last spring, and I still can't decide whether I wish I'd never found what I found, or whether I'm grateful to finally understand what was really happening. I work as a librarian in Manchester. Nothing particularly exciting about it. Helping students find resources, managing overdue fines, keeping the reading rooms quiet, the sort of job that most people assume is pleasant but boring, which it mostly is, except for the occasional problem patron or the odd technical issue with our computer systems. The trouble started when several of our regular users began complaining about their personal devices being compromised after using our public internet. Nothing dramatic at first, just spam emails and suspicious login attempts. But the pattern was specific enough to suggest someone was targeting library users. Our IT support was limited to a part-time contractor who came in twice a week, and he wasn't particularly helpful when I raised the issue. He ran some basic scans, updated our security software, and assured me that our network was secure. But the complaints continued, and they were all coming from users who'd been in the library during specific time periods. I started paying more attention to who was using the computers during those times, trying to identify any patterns or recurring faces. Most of our users were students from the local university or college, but there were a few regulars who didn't fit the typical academic profile. One in particular caught my attention, a middle-aged man who always chose the same computer terminal and seemed to spend an unusual amount of time on activities that required very little visible interaction with the screen. He was quiet and unremarkable, the sort of person you'd never notice in a crowd. Always wore dark, nondescript clothing and carried a small backpack that he kept close to his workstation. He always turned up mid-afternoon when the place was busy enough to blend in, but not so packed he'd lose his favorite terminal. What struck me as odd was his behavior around the computer itself. Most people using public terminals either work intensively, typing, clicking, scrolling through pages, or they browse casually, moving between different websites and applications. His activity was different. He'd sit very still for long periods, occasionally making small adjustments or inputs, but mostly just watching the screen with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to whatever he was doing. The breakthrough came when I started tracking the complaints more carefully. Every single compromised user had been sitting at terminals adjacent to his usual spot during his visits. Not the same computer, but close enough that someone with the right equipment might be able to intercept their data. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't just using our computers, he was hunting other users. I started researching methods that could be used to compromise devices on public networks. What I found was both more sophisticated and more accessible than I'd expected. There were simple tools that would allow someone to capture login details and access other devices connected to the same network. The idea that someone could be watching your screen, reading your messages, maybe even seeing through your webcam, it made my skin crawl. The research led me into corners of the internet I'd never explored before, hidden communities where people shared surveillance techniques. The deeper I went, the more disturbed I became by what was apparently possible with gear and software that anyone with curiosity and time could learn to use. Some of the forums contained posts about targeting public spaces like libraries and cafes. Users traded advice on identifying vulnerable targets and avoiding detection. The casual tone of these exchanges was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. They talked about surveillance and privacy invasion as if it were a hobby. But it was the references to live monitoring that really made my blood run cold. There were sections dedicated to real-time observation of compromised devices, where participants could watch victims' activities as they happened. This wasn't just about stealing data. It was about the thrill of invasion, watching people without their knowledge. Reading about the live monitoring capabilities, I began to understand what might have been happening in our library. The man at the terminal wasn't just stealing data from other users. He might have been providing access to their devices for others to watch in real time. The thought that people could be sitting in our reading rooms, unaware that their every action was being observed by strangers, was genuinely horrifying. Posts explored the psychology of targets, strategies for prolonging surveillance, and methods for gaining access to webcams and microphones. One thread outlined how to turn victims' own devices into surveillance equipment that could monitor their private spaces. What made it worse was the realization that this was happening in places I recognized, affecting people I saw every day. The forums contained references to specific locations in Manchester and posts that suggested active operations in areas I knew well. I started watching him more carefully, trying to understand exactly what he was doing during his daily visits. His timing was precise. He'd arrive when the library was busy enough to provide cover, but not so crowded that he couldn't secure his preferred terminal. He brought his own equipment, small devices that he'd connect discreetly to the computer or position near other workstations. Most concerning was his attention to other users. He'd spend time observing people who sat near his workstation, and I began to notice patterns in his interest. He favored younger users, particularly women, and seemed drawn to people who appeared nervous or unfamiliar with the technology. There was something predatory in the way he'd position himself to watch them work, as if their confusion made them easier to own. Sometimes I'd catch him making small notes in a pocket diary, and the careful way he'd glance around before writing suggested these weren't innocent reminders. I realized that confronting him directly would likely just cause him to move his operation elsewhere, but I also couldn't ignore what was happening, knowing that people were being violated in ways they couldn't detect. The decision to document his activities felt like the only responsible option. I started taking discreet photographs of his setup, noting the times of his visits, and recording details about the equipment he used. The evidence wasn't dramatic, but it painted a clear picture of systematic surveillance activities. But gathering evidence meant spending more time observing his behavior, which led me deeper into understanding what he was actually doing. The forums I'd found contained guides for the exact techniques he seemed to be employing, and posts about the data that could be captured through these methods. The most disturbing discovery was that our library wasn't unique. The forums contained references to similar operations in public spaces across the country, suggesting coordination between different locations and operators. Reading through these discussions, I began to understand that what I'd witnessed was part of something much larger. The man in our library wasn't acting alone. He was part of a community that shared targets and techniques. The surveillance was being conducted for the entertainment of people who existed specifically to watch others without their knowledge. The realization that everything I did in public spaces might be subject to this kind of monitoring fundamentally changed how I moved through the world. Every public computer, every Wi-Fi network, every device I used outside my home became a potential point of vulnerability. I tried reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but explaining the technical aspects and providing evidence for activities that were designed to be invisible proved nearly impossible. The documentation I'd gathered looked circumstantial, and the online communities operated in ways that made them difficult to investigate. The complaints from library users eventually stopped, not because the problem had been resolved, but because he stopped coming. One day, he simply didn't appear at his usual time, and we never saw him again. His absence should have felt like a resolution, but instead it raised new questions about where he'd gone and whether his activities had simply moved to a different location. The forum stayed active, still filled with strategies and shared footage. Whatever had been happening in our library was apparently just one small component of something that continued to function regardless of any individual participant. I still work at the library, still help people with research and technical problems, still try to maintain the public service that libraries are supposed to provide. But I can't shake the knowledge of what might be happening to the people who use our services. I used to think my dad was just a workaholic. You know, one of those guys who can't sit still. The kind that's always got a bag packed near the door. Always talking about flights and meetings and early starts in places you've only ever seen in airport codes. That's how he was growing up. Gone a lot. I got used to the rhythm of it. 3 or 4 days away back on Sunday. Gone again by Wednesday. He'd bring home duty-free Toblerones and weird coins from countries I couldn't pronounce. I never really asked questions. It just became normal. But the last time he left, he never came back. He told us it was a longer trip, said he had to go to Turkey for something, then maybe Dubai. I didn't think much of it at the time. He'd done that route before. I figured he'd be home in 2 weeks, maybe 3. A month passed, then 6 weeks. My mum stopped talking about it by the 8th. She just kind of shut down. Whenever I brought it up, she'd say he was fine. That work was just complicated. But her voice sounded more and more like someone trying to convince themselves. I don't really know why I ended up on the dark web again. I'd poked around when I was younger, just out of boredom. Never bought anything or got deep into it. But that night, something pulled me back in. Maybe I was just restless, or maybe I was looking for answers in places that didn't make sense. It started like it always does. Tor browser, forums, threads that feel dead until you see the view count and realize thousands of people are reading, just not talking. I went further than I'd gone before. Clicked through a string of buried links that led to a directory full of pages with single-word names. One of them said Showcase. That's where I found it. It wasn't called a red room, not directly, but the moment the page loaded, I knew what it was. A live stream, minimal interface, one embedded video window with live in the corner. No playback controls. Just a view account that flickered between 13 and 15 like it was trying to catch up. The camera was pointed at a man sitting in a chair. His face was swollen, lip split, dried blood down the side of his neck. He was tied at the wrists and ankles, breathing through his mouth like every inhale hurt. I couldn't tell if he was conscious. His head lolled forward, chin against his chest. Something about him felt familiar. That's what got me. At first I couldn't place it, but the way he sat, the posture, the slope of his shoulders, the thinning grey hair. I thought it was my dad. Everything in me went cold. I leaned forward, watching the pixels shift with every frame, trying to tell if it was really him. The lighting was low, red-tinged, and the camera had this slight fisheye distortion, but it looked like him. Then someone else stepped into the frame. A man, taller, dressed in dark clothing, face covered in shadows. He had gloves on and something long in one hand. I thought it was a bat at first. Then I saw the blade catch the light. I couldn't move. I just sat there, watching, heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I don't even remember reaching for the keyboard, but I must have, because I typed something in the chat box below the stream. Just one word. Dad? That's when everything shifted. The man in the background turned, slowly, like he'd heard a noise from behind the camera, and looked straight into the lens. The angle wasn't great. His face was half obscured, but I saw enough, the shape of his jaw, the small scar above his eyebrow, the way his right hand twitched, just a little, when he was thinking. It wasn't the man in the chair who was my dad. It was the one holding the knife. My fingers hovered above the keys, I didn't know what to type. My whole body locked up. And then, without hesitation, he stepped forward, raised the blade, and ended it. Just like that. No pause, no words. The man in the chair jerked once, then nothing. The stream cut to black. The site crashed immediately after. When I tried to reload it, I got a 404 error. Every link I'd used to get there led nowhere. It was like the whole thing had been scrubbed in real time. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat at my desk, lights off, trying to tell myself I'd made a mistake, that it wasn't him, that my brain had filled in the gaps with what it wanted to believe. But the scar above the eye, the twitch in the hand, you don't imagine that. I never saw him again. No calls, no emails, no body. He was just gone. I never told my mum. I didn't see the point. What could I say? That I saw him in a murder live stream, that he wasn't the victim. I've gone over that moment again and again, trying to make sense of it. Why he did it, who he was working with, if it had been going on for years, if every business trip had been a cover for something darker. I wish I'd never clicked anything that night. I wish I didn't look. But most of all, I wish I hadn't typed that word. Because I think he saw it. I think he recognized it. And I think that's why he did what he did. I think it was because of me. Picture this. You're scrolling through your emails one morning and find an invitation to an exclusive event. Premium location, limited attendance, significant financial reward for participation. The kind of opportunity that seems too good to be true, but legitimate enough that you don't immediately delete it. Now picture discovering that the event isn't what you thought it was, and by the time you realize what you've agreed to, it's far too late to back out. I work in market research for a consultancy firm in Leeds. Nothing glamorous. Consumer surveys, focus groups, the occasional product launch analysis. The pay is decent enough, but it's the kind of job where you're always looking for ways to supplement your income. Freelance work, weekend surveys, anything that might add a few £100 to your monthly earnings. That's why the email caught my attention. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, mixed in with the usual spam and work correspondence. The subject line was simple enough. Research opportunity, exclusive participation required. The sender was someone called Dr. Sarah Chen from something called the Institute for Behavioral Studies. The email was professionally written, explaining that they were conducting a specialized research project on group dynamics and social behavior. They needed participants with specific qualifications, university educated, working in research or analysis, comfortable with technology and unconventional research methods. The compensation was substantial. £500 for a single evening's participation, with the possibility of ongoing work for suitable candidates. I looked up the Institute for Behavioral Studies online. They had a legitimate-looking website, published research papers, even a few academic staff profiles. Dr. Chen appeared to be a real person with proper credentials from Manchester University. Everything seemed above board, if a bit vague about the actual nature of the research. The application process was straightforward. Basic personal information, employment history, some questions about my comfort level with technology, and unusual research scenarios. They asked about my experience with online platforms, whether I'd used secure communication tools, how I felt about observing human behavior in controlled environments. Within a week, I received confirmation that I'd been selected for the study. The details were sparse but intriguing. I would need to attend a briefing session in Manchester, followed by the main research event later that evening. All travel expenses would be covered, plus the £500 participation fee. The only requirement was that I sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before the briefing. The location was a serviced office building near Manchester city centre. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of research companies rent temporary spaces for focus groups and studies. I arrived on the specified date to find about 20 other people in the waiting area, all roughly my age and background, all looking slightly puzzled about what they'd signed up for. Dr. Chen turned out to be exactly as advertised. A professional academic in her 40s, well-spoken and authoritative. She explained that we would be participating in a study of group behavior and decision-making in high-pressure situations. The research involved observing and interacting with subjects in a controlled environment, measuring our responses to various scenarios. The technology component, she explained, was necessary for participant privacy and research integrity. We would be accessing the observation environment through a secure network, using encrypted connections to ensure anonymity. Each participant would be given a laptop with pre-installed software for the session. We were led to individual workstations in a larger room, each with a laptop and a set of instructions. The software we needed to use was something called Tor browser, which Dr. Chen explained was standard for research requiring participant anonymity. We would be accessing a private research platform that could only be reached through this secure network. The initial briefing made it sound like a sophisticated version of reality television. We would be observing people in various scenarios and making decisions about how situations should develop. Our choices would be aggregated with other participants to determine the direction of the research. It was described as a study of collective decision-making and moral reasoning under pressure. The platform, when we accessed it, looked professional enough. Clean interface, clear instructions, participant guidelines. We were told we would be observing subjects who had volunteered for a separate study and consented to being filmed. Our role was to vote on various scenarios and observe how different situations affected group dynamics. The first session seemed innocuous. We were watching what appeared to be a focus group. 8 people sitting around a table discussing consumer preferences. Our job was to vote on which topics the moderator should introduce next, how the discussion should be guided, what questions would be most revealing about group behavior. It felt like legitimate research, the kind of thing you might see in any market research facility across the country. The participants seemed natural, unaware they were being observed by external researchers. We made our votes through the platform interface, and the focus group moderator would adjust their questioning accordingly. After about an hour, Dr. Chen explained that the next phase would be more intensive. The subjects would be moved to individual observation rooms, where we could study their behavior in isolation. This was where the real research would begin, understanding how people behaved when they thought they were alone, versus how they acted in groups. The individual observation sessions were more uncomfortable. We were watching people in what looked like small windowless rooms, apparently unaware they were being filmed. The platform allowed us to vote on various environmental changes, adjusting lighting, temperature, introducing background noises. The idea was to measure stress responses and coping mechanisms. I started to feel uneasy about the whole thing. The people we were observing seemed genuinely distressed by some of the environmental changes. When we voted to increase the room temperature, we could see them becoming visibly uncomfortable. When background noise was introduced, they showed clear signs of agitation and confusion. Dr. Chen explained that this was normal for behavioral research. The subjects had consented to psychological stress testing as part of their participation agreement. What we were seeing was valuable data about human resilience and adaptation. The distress was temporary and carefully controlled to avoid lasting harm. But as the evening progressed, the scenarios became more extreme. We were voting on whether to restrict access to water, whether to introduce disturbing sounds, whether to dim the lights to near darkness. The people we were observing were showing increasing signs of panic and distress. The platform interface had evolved too. Instead of simple voting options, we were now bidding on scenarios using virtual credits. The higher the bid, the more likely our chosen option would be implemented. It had turned into a kind of auction system, with participants competing to direct the action. Some of the other participants seemed to be enjoying it. I could hear suppressed laughter from nearby workstations when particularly distressing scenarios were implemented. People were bidding aggressively on options that would cause maximum psychological pressure on the subjects. I tried to bid on less harmful options to counteract what the others were doing, but I quickly realized that some people were bidding with what seemed like unlimited virtual credits. Whatever system was in place, some participants had far more influence than others. The worst part was watching the subject's deterioration. What had started as mild discomfort had escalated to genuine terror. These people were trapped in small rooms, subjected to psychological pressure that was clearly beyond anything they could have consented to. And we were the ones directing it, voting on new ways to torment them. I tried to close the laptop and leave, but Dr. Chen approached my workstation. She explained quietly that participants were required to complete the full session to receive payment. More importantly, the non-disclosure agreement I'd signed included specific penalties for early withdrawal or breach of confidentiality. The penalties were substantial. Several £1,000s in compensation for disrupted research. So I stayed. I watched as the scenarios became increasingly extreme, as the subjects were pushed beyond psychological breaking points. I made token bids on harmless options while others seemed to compete for the most creative forms of torment. By the end of the session, several of the subjects had suffered what appeared to be complete psychological breakdowns. They were catatonic, unresponsive, clearly traumatized by whatever they'd experienced in those rooms. The platform recorded our collective decisions and thanked us for our participation in the research study. Dr. Chen provided payment as promised, along with contact information for future research opportunities. She reminded us of our confidentiality obligations and the legal consequences of discussing the research with anyone outside the authorized team. I left Manchester that night feeling sick about what I'd witnessed and participated in. But I also had £500 in my account and the promise of more work if I was interested. The money was more than I made in a week at my regular job. Over the following days, I tried to research the Institute for Behavioral Studies more thoroughly. The website was still there, but when I looked more carefully, the academic papers seemed to be fake. The staff profiles used stock photos, and the university affiliations couldn't be verified. I also started to doubt whether what I'd witnessed was actually research at all. The whole setup felt more like entertainment than academic study. The bidding system, the competitive element, the focus on causing distress rather than understanding behavior, it all suggested something much darker than legitimate research. But I couldn't report it without implicating myself. I'd signed legal documents, participated willingly, even made decisions that contributed to whatever those people had suffered. Any investigation would reveal my involvement and potentially lead to the legal consequences Dr. Chen had warned about. 2 weeks later, I received another invitation. Same format, same professional presentation, but this time the compensation was higher. £1,000 for participation. The email mentioned that I'd been selected for a premium research program based on my previous contributions. I should have deleted it immediately. Should have blocked the sender and tried to forget the whole thing had ever happened. But £1,000 was substantial money, and I told myself that maybe I could participate without actively contributing to harm. Maybe I could bid on harmless options, try to protect the subjects rather than torment them. The second session was worse, much worse. The subjects weren't just being psychologically pressured, they were being physically harmed, not severely, but deliberately and systematically. Small injuries, controlled pain, careful degradation designed to break them down completely. And the other participants were enthusiastic about it. They were bidding enormous amounts on scenarios that would cause maximum suffering. The virtual credit system had been replaced with what looked like real money, pounds sterling being transferred in real time to implement specific forms of torture. I realized I wasn't participating in research at all. I was part of an audience paying to watch and direct real torture, broadcast live through the dark web to paying customers around the world. The professional presentation, the academic credentials, the research terminology, it was all camouflage for something much more sinister. The subjects weren't volunteers who had consented to psychological testing. They were victims, probably kidnapped or coerced, being tortured for the entertainment of people wealthy enough to pay premium prices for customized suffering. And I was one of them. By participating, by staying silent, by accepting payment for my involvement, I'd become part of a network that treated human torture as interactive entertainment. The sessions continued monthly. Each time, the compensation increased, and the scenarios became more extreme. I told myself I was trying to minimize harm by bidding on less severe options, but I knew I was just rationalizing my continued participation. The money was addictive. Thousands of pounds for a few hours of watching screens and clicking buttons. More than I made in months at my regular job. It let me move to a better flat, buy things I'd never been able to afford, live a lifestyle that would have been impossible on my normal salary. But I also knew that every session I attended meant more people were being tortured for entertainment. Real people suffering real pain, while audiences around the world paid to watch and participate in their degradation. The network was vast. What I thought was a small research study was actually one node in a global system. There were hundreds of these sessions running simultaneously, different themes and scenarios for different audiences. The technology allowed real-time interaction between viewers and victims, turning torture into a personalized entertainment service. The worst part was realizing how many people were involved. The sessions I attended had dozens of participants, each paying substantial amounts for the privilege of directing human suffering. Multiply that across hundreds of simultaneous sessions, and you're looking at thousands of people who treat torture as entertainment. These weren't criminals or social outcasts. They were people with professional jobs, disposable income, the technical knowledge to access dark web platforms. They were probably colleagues, neighbors, maybe even friends and family members. Normal people who had found a way to pay for something monstrous, while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. I still receive invitations to new sessions, premium events, exclusive content, opportunities to direct increasingly extreme scenarios. The compensation offers have reached amounts that would change my life permanently. Enough money to quit my job, buy a house, never worry about financial security again. And I'm tempted. Not because I enjoy watching people suffer, but because the money would solve every problem I have. Because it's easy to rationalize participation when the alternative is returning to financial stress and career uncertainty. The invitations come from different sources now, but they're clearly part of the same network. Academic institutions, research organizations, market research companies, all fronts for the same underlying system. They've probably identified thousands of potential participants, people with the right combination of financial need and moral flexibility to become part of their audience. The person sitting next to you at work might have attended one of these sessions last night. Your university lecturer, your doctor, your neighbor, any of them could be supplementing their income by paying to watch and direct real torture. And the victims could be anyone. People who responded to job advertisements, answered research invitations, trusted professional-looking organizations, people like me, who thought they were participating in legitimate work until it was too late to back out. The next time you see a research invitation with unusually high compensation, or a job opportunity that seems too good to be true, remember that some offers are designed to compromise you gradually, to make you complicit in something horrible through small steps and financial incentives. You might already be on their lists. They might already know exactly what compensation amount would be enough to make you consider participating. What professional presentation would convince you it was legitimate? And once you've attended one session, once you've accepted payment for your participation, you're part of the network whether you want to be or not. Because they know that most people, faced with the choice between exposing themselves or staying silent, will choose to protect their own interests, just like I did. There's a moment when you realize that boredom can be more dangerous than any addiction. It creeps up slowly, day after day, of the same routine, until suddenly you're willing to do almost anything just to feel something different. That's how I ended up in a situation that still keeps me awake at night, checking the locks on my door and wondering if those footsteps in the hallway outside are just my imagination. I was in my second year at Leeds, studying media communications. One of those degrees that sounds impressive but basically prepares you for nothing except disappointment. Living in a grotty flat in Headingley that I could barely afford on my student loan. Spending most evenings alone because my flatmates had either dropped out or transferred to proper universities where they actually learned useful skills. The flat was everything you'd expect from student accommodation that charged £300 a month. Damp patches on the ceiling, heating that worked when it felt like it, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbours arguing about whose turn it was to buy toilet roll. My room was just large enough for a single bed, a desk that wobbled if you looked at it wrong, and a wardrobe that smelled permanently of mildew. Most nights followed the same pattern. Lectures during the day where lecturers who'd never worked in media told us about industries they'd only read about in textbooks. Then back to the flat for microwave meals and whatever passed for entertainment on my ancient laptop. I'd scroll through social media, watch YouTube videos, occasionally attempt to do coursework that felt increasingly pointless with each passing week. That's how I discovered the forums. Not deliberately. I was researching something for an essay about digital communities when I stumbled across discussions that went deeper than anything I'd seen on mainstream platforms. People talking about privacy, digital freedom, the parts of the internet that existed beyond corporate oversight. It seemed more real than anything I was learning in lectures, more honest than the sanitized world of Facebook and Instagram. The transition to exploring these hidden communities happened gradually. Someone would mention a forum that required special access, or reference a discussion happening on platforms I'd never heard of. Gradually, I learned about tools that could hide your digital footprint, networks that existed parallel to the regular internet but invisible to casual users. It wasn't difficult to access once you knew where to look. There were guides, communities dedicated to helping newcomers navigate safely. Within a few weeks, I had access to a whole parallel internet that felt more authentic than anything I'd encountered in my media studies courses. Most of it was surprisingly mundane. Political discussions that would be censored elsewhere, marketplaces for things that existed in legal grey areas, communities of people who simply preferred to communicate without corporate surveillance. It felt like discovering a hidden city that existed alongside the one everyone else knew about. The first few months, I just observed, reading forums about digital rights, privacy advocacy, discussions of philosophy and politics that went deeper than anything happening in university seminars. There was something addictive about being part of these communities, people who seemed more intelligent, more informed, more aware of how the world actually worked than anyone I knew in real life. I started contributing to discussions, sharing thoughts about media manipulation and corporate control of information. My posts were well received, and gradually I began to build a reputation within certain communities. People started recognizing my username, inviting me to private forums with more exclusive content. That's where I first heard about live streaming communities. Not the obvious stuff, gaming streams and social media influencers, but underground networks that broadcast content you couldn't find anywhere else. Documentary footage from conflict zones, investigative reports that mainstream media wouldn't touch, real journalism that existed outside corporate control. The concept appealed to me immediately. As someone studying media, the idea of accessing unfiltered content, seeing events as they actually happened rather than how they were packaged for mass consumption, felt like the logical extension of everything I was learning about information control and narrative manipulation. The invitation came through a private message from someone I'd been discussing media theory with for several weeks. They'd noticed my interest in authentic journalism and wondered if I'd like to observe some live investigative work. A research collective, they called it, documenting social experiments and human behavior studies that universities wouldn't approve, but which provided genuine insights into psychology and social dynamics. They included access details for a private streaming platform and a scheduled time, that Thursday at 10:30. No explanation of what specific research I'd be observing, just an invitation to witness something most people would never see. The academic framing made it feel legitimate, important, like I was being offered access to cutting-edge research that would enhance my understanding of media and human behavior. The streaming platform was simple but professional looking. Clean interface, high-quality video feeds, chat functionality that allowed viewers to discuss what they were observing. When I connected at the appointed time, there were already about 15 people online, and they welcomed me warmly. The conversation was exactly what I'd expected from an academic community. People discussed research methodologies, shared insights about psychological principles, debated the ethics of observational studies. Someone mentioned they were pursuing a PhD in social psychology at Durham. Another person talked about their work in documentary filmmaking. They seemed like exactly the kind of intelligent, engaged people I'd been hoping to find in university, but never had. The research subject that night was social isolation and peer pressure. We were observing how an individual responded to being placed in an unfamiliar environment with limited social contact, measuring their psychological adaptation and decision-making under stress. The academic discussion was fascinating. People analyzed body language, predicted behavioral responses, shared relevant research from established psychology journals. The observation space was a small, clinical-looking room with white walls and professional lighting. A single chair faced multiple cameras, and monitoring equipment lined one wall. It looked exactly like the kind of setup you'd expect from a legitimate research facility, clean and organized, and obviously expensive. The subject was a young man, probably around my age, who'd volunteered for what he believed was a standard psychology experiment. The researchers explained through the chat that he'd been told he was participating in a study about decision-making under stress, which was technically accurate, but didn't reveal the full scope of what was being measured. What followed was subtle psychological manipulation presented as scientific methodology. The subject was asked to make increasingly difficult choices, each decision designed to measure his responses to social pressure and isolation. The academic observers discussed his reactions with clinical detachment, noting signs of stress and predicting how his behavior would change as the experiment progressed. I found myself genuinely engaged with the research. This was the kind of real-world psychology that my university courses only touched on theoretically. Here was an actual experiment, measuring genuine human responses in controlled conditions. The academic discussion was more sophisticated than anything happening in my lectures, and I felt privileged to be observing cutting-edge research as it happened. Over the following weeks, I became a regular participant in these observation sessions. Different subjects, different experimental scenarios, but always the same rigorous academic approach. The research collective was studying various aspects of human psychology: social conformity, authority compliance, stress responses, decision-making under pressure. Each session provided new insights that enhanced my understanding of media manipulation and audience psychology. The other observers were consistently impressive. Postgraduate students, academic researchers, documentary filmmakers interested in authentic human behavior. They shared reading recommendations, discussed theoretical frameworks, debated ethical considerations with the kind of intellectual sophistication I'd been hoping to find in university. These felt like the real education I'd been looking for. My contributions to the discussions were increasingly valued by the group. They seemed impressed by my insights into media theory and audience psychology, often asking for my perspective on how different experimental scenarios might be perceived by mainstream audiences. Gradually, I began to feel like a genuine member of the research community rather than just an observer. That's when they started suggesting I might be interested in contributing more directly to the research. The suggestion came casually, almost as an afterthought, during a particularly engaging discussion about experimental methodology. Someone mentioned that having perspectives from different academic backgrounds would enhance the research, and several people agreed that my media studies knowledge would provide valuable insights into audience psychology and narrative construction. The research coordinator, the person who'd originally invited me, explained that they were always looking for participants who understood the academic value of the work. Someone with my background could contribute both as an observer and as a subject, providing comparative data about how media-literate individuals responded to the same experimental conditions they'd been testing on less educated volunteers. I felt flattered. These people, whose intelligence and academic credentials I respected, were telling me I had something valuable to offer. They weren't just inviting me to observe research. They were asking me to become part of it, to contribute to studies that could advance understanding of human psychology and media manipulation. The logistics were straightforward. They operated several research facilities around the country, including one in Manchester that would be convenient for me to reach from Leeds. Sessions typically lasted a few hours, and participants were compensated for their time. More importantly, I would be contributing to research that had genuine academic value, work that might eventually be published in respected journals. I agreed without hesitation. The opportunity to be part of legitimate psychological research especially research that aligned with my academic interests, was exactly the kind of experience that would distinguish my degree from the theoretical nonsense most of my classmates were learning. The arrangements were handled through encrypted messaging, which seemed appropriate for sensitive research that hadn't yet been published. They provided an address in Manchester's city centre and a time, the following Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. I was told to bring identification and any questions I might have about the research methodology. The building was exactly what I'd expected from a legitimate research facility. Modern office block in Manchester's business district, professional signage, security desk in the lobby. I gave my name to the receptionist, who confirmed my appointment and directed me to the 7th floor. The research coordinator met me at the lift, an academic-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She seemed exactly right for the role, speaking with the kind of measured authority I associated with university lecturers, but with more genuine warmth than most of my actual professors managed. The facility itself was impressive. Clean corridors lined with office doors bearing academic titles, research laboratories with expensive-looking equipment, meeting rooms where serious-looking people discussed what appeared to be legitimate academic work. Everything reinforced the impression that this was real research being conducted by qualified professionals. Dr. Mitchell explained the day's experimental protocol as we walked towards the observation room. They were testing responses to social isolation, combined with peer pressure, measuring how quickly intelligent individuals adapted their behavior when placed in unfamiliar social situations. My media studies background made me an ideal subject, she explained, because I would be more aware than most people of the techniques being used, allowing them to measure the effectiveness of these methods on educated, media-literate participants. The observation room was larger than it had appeared through the streaming platform. The same clinical white walls and professional lighting, but seeing it in person made the setup seem even more legitimate. This was clearly expensive equipment, operated by people who knew what they were doing. Other members of the research team were present, people I recognized from the streaming sessions, though seeing them in person made them seem more human, more relatable. They greeted me warmly, expressing genuine excitement about my participation in the research. Someone mentioned that my insights during previous observation sessions had been particularly valuable, and they were looking forward to seeing how I responded as a subject rather than an observer. The initial part of the experiment was exactly what I'd expected. Basic questionnaires about my background and psychological profile, measurements of baseline stress indicators, explanations of the monitoring equipment that would track my responses throughout the session. Everything was conducted with the kind of professional methodology I associated with legitimate academic research. Then they explained the specific experimental scenario. I would be placed in the observation chair and asked to make a series of decisions while being monitored by the research team. The decisions would start simple but gradually become more complex, measuring how my responses changed as social pressure increased. The other team members would observe through a live stream, documenting my reactions and discussing my behavior in real time. The academic framing made everything seem reasonable, even beneficial. This was research that could advance understanding of media manipulation and audience psychology. My participation would contribute to studies that might eventually help people recognize and resist propaganda techniques. The work had genuine social value, and I was privileged to be part of it. I took my place in the observation chair, facing the cameras that would broadcast my responses to the research team. The lighting was professional but not uncomfortable, and the monitoring equipment was less intrusive than I'd expected. Dr. Mitchell explained that the session would last approximately 2 hours, during which I would be asked to respond to various scenarios while my psychological and physiological responses were measured. The first scenarios were straightforward, simple decision-making exercises designed to establish baseline measurements. I was asked to choose between different options while the research team observed my thought processes. The discussions I could hear through speakers in the room were exactly what I'd participated in during previous sessions. Academic analysis of body language, stress indicators, decision-making patterns. But gradually, the scenarios became more personal. Instead of abstract choices, I was asked to discuss my own life, my fears, my ambitions. The research team's observations became more focused on my individual psychology rather than general human behavior. Their academic discussions started including specific details about my background that I hadn't provided during the initial questionnaires. That's when I began to realize something was wrong. The information they were discussing, details about my university course, my financial situation, my family background, hadn't come from anything I told them during the session. They knew about my student debt, my poor relationship with my parents, my lack of close friendships at university, information that could only have come from extensive research into my personal life. Dr. Mitchell noticed my growing discomfort and explained that background research was standard procedure for this type of psychological study. They needed to understand participants' motivational frameworks to properly analyze their responses. The information had been gathered through standard academic channels, student records, social media analysis, public databases. Nothing invasive, just the kind of background research that any legitimate study would require. But the academic observers' discussions were becoming less clinical and more personal. They talked about my loneliness, my desperation for intellectual connection, my willingness to do almost anything to feel part of a community that valued my contributions. Their analysis was accurate but felt invasive, like they were dissecting my personality for entertainment rather than scientific understanding. The scenarios they presented became increasingly uncomfortable. Instead of simple decision-making exercises, I was asked to discuss my deepest insecurities, my most embarrassing experiences, my greatest fears. The research team's observations became correspondingly more intimate, analyzing not just my responses, but my motivations, my psychological vulnerabilities, my desperate need for validation. When I expressed discomfort with the direction the session was taking, Dr. Mitchell assured me that this was normal. Psychological research often required participants to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The temporary discomfort I was experiencing was necessary for the research to have genuine value. Backing out now would invalidate hours of preparation and waste the opportunity to contribute to important academic work. The pressure was subtle but persistent. They reminded me of how enthusiastic I'd been about participating, how much I'd valued being part of the research community, how disappointed they would be if I couldn't follow through on my commitment. The academic framing made my reluctance seem immature, unintellectual, as if I was prioritizing my personal comfort over scientific advancement. But the observers' discussions were becoming less about research and more about entertainment. They talked about my responses as if I was performing for their amusement, rather than contributing to academic study. Their analysis of my psychology became increasingly invasive, dissecting my personality with the kind of casual cruelty that had nothing to do with scientific methodology. That's when I realized that the academic observers weren't researchers or graduate students. They were paying customers, anonymous viewers who enjoyed watching real psychological manipulation presented as legitimate research. The sophisticated discussions, the academic credentials, the professional facility, all of it was elaborate theater designed to make victims complicit in their own exploitation. I tried to leave, but Dr. Mitchell explained that the session wasn't complete. They'd invested significant resources in this research, and my participation was crucial for the data to have statistical validity. Leaving now would waste months of preparation and invalidate everything they'd learned. More importantly, I'd signed consent forms agreeing to participate in the full experimental protocol. The consent forms I'd signed so casually were more comprehensive than I'd realized. I'd agreed not just to participate in psychological research, but to continue until the academic objectives were met. I'd waived rights to withdraw consent during the session, acknowledging that temporary discomfort was necessary for legitimate research. I'd even agreed to confidentiality clauses that would prevent me from discussing the specific methodologies being used. The observers' discussions became openly predatory. They talked about how long I would resist, what it would take to break down my remaining psychological defenses, how much payment they were willing to make for specific responses. The academic pretense was dropped entirely, replaced by the casual cruelty of people who enjoyed watching others suffer. But I was still in the chair, facing cameras that broadcast my growing panic to anonymous viewers who were betting on my psychological breakdown. The professional lighting that had seemed so legitimate now felt harsh, clinical, designed to capture every detail of my distress for the entertainment of people I would never see. Dr. Mitchell continued to frame everything in academic terms, but her explanations became increasingly hollow. This was research into psychological resilience, she insisted. My responses were providing valuable data about stress management and social compliance. The temporary discomfort I was experiencing was necessary for the advancement of human understanding. The session continued for hours. Psychological pressure disguised as research methodology, invasive questioning presented as scientific inquiry, deliberate humiliation framed as academic observation. The anonymous viewers discussed my responses with the detached interest of people watching a particularly engaging television program, placing bets on how long I would maintain my composure. I don't remember exactly how I got away. The details are blurred by stress and the psychological manipulation I'd endured. I think there was some kind of technical problem with the streaming equipment, a brief moment when the observers were distracted, and I managed to leave the chair and find the exit. Or maybe Dr. Mitchell simply decided the session had provided enough entertainment for the paying viewers. I found myself on a Manchester street with no clear memory of how I'd gotten there. The business district looked normal, professional, exactly like somewhere legitimate research might be conducted. But I knew now that the building I'd just left was something else entirely. A facility designed to exploit people's desire for intellectual connection and academic validation. The journey back to Leeds was a blur. I sat on the train staring out the window, trying to process what had happened. The academic discussions I'd found so engaging, the research community I'd felt so privileged to join, the intellectual validation I'd craved so desperately. All of it had been designed to make me complicit in my own exploitation. That was 8 months ago. I've never reported what happened. Who would believe that a legitimate-seeming research facility was actually a sophisticated operation designed to exploit curious students? The academic credentials seemed real. The facility was professional, and I'd participated voluntarily after signing consent forms that probably covered every legal requirement. But I've learned to recognize the signs now. The casual invitations to observe research, the flattery about academic insight, the gradual escalation from observer to participant. The same patterns that led me into that room are being used to recruit other people, other students, who are bored and lonely and desperate for intellectual connection. I still get invitations occasionally, from different usernames on different platforms. Always the same academic framing, the same promise of authentic research opportunities. I delete them immediately, but I can't delete the knowledge that somewhere out there people are still being recruited for research projects that have nothing to do with advancing human understanding. The flat in Headingley feels different now. The thin walls and broken heating that once seemed like minor inconveniences now feel like vulnerabilities. I've changed my daily routines, varied my schedule, become more careful about what personal information I share online. But sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and I'm lying awake listening to footsteps in the corridor, I wonder if they know where I live. Because the thing about that kind of operation is that they don't just exploit you once and move on. They build profiles, gather information, create detailed psychological assessments that could be valuable for future projects. I was part of their research for months before I became a subject, and they learned everything they needed to know about what motivates me, what frightens me, what I'm willing to do for validation and intellectual connection. The academic community I thought I'd found doesn't exist. Real research happens in universities with proper oversight and ethical guidelines. But the desire for intellectual connection, for being part of something important and meaningful, is real enough. And there are people who understand how to exploit that desire, how to make isolation and boredom feel like academic opportunity. I'm finishing my degree this year, though media communications feels even more pointless now than it did before. The theoretical frameworks we study in lectures seem naive compared to what I've learned about psychological manipulation and social engineering. But I've also learned that the real world is full of people who understand human psychology better than any university course could teach. The chair is still out there somewhere, in a professional-looking facility with academic credentials and research equipment. And they're still recruiting participants, still finding people who are bored enough and lonely enough and desperate enough for intellectual validation to sign consent forms they don't fully understand. Sometimes I think about the young man I observed during my first session, the volunteer who thought he was participating in standard psychological research. I wonder if he ever realized what was really happening, if he managed to leave before they asked him to become a regular participant, if he's somewhere now checking logs and listening for footsteps and wondering if those casual invitations he receives are what they claim to be. Because once you've been in that chair, once you felt those cameras capturing every detail of your psychological breakdown for the entertainment of anonymous viewers, you never really feel safe again. The academic pretense might be dropped, the session might end, but the knowledge that there are people out there who enjoy watching human suffering remains. Imagine discovering that every disturbing sound you've dismissed as normal city noise was actually someone's final moments being broadcast to thousands of paying viewers on the dark web. The thing about living in a converted warehouse in East London is that you get used to strange noises. Industrial buildings weren't designed for residential living, so sounds carry in odd ways through the concrete and steel. For 2 years, I thought the sounds coming from the flat below mine were just part of urban life. Deliveries, renovations, the occasional late-night party. Now I know better, and in approximately 18 hours, I'm going to become the star of the same dark web broadcasts I've been unknowingly listening to through my floorboards. I moved into my flat in Hackney Wick after university, when the area was still affordable for someone working entry-level jobs in marketing. The building used to be a textile factory, converted into a dozen small flats with thin walls and thinner floors. Most of my neighbors were artists, freelancers, or young professionals like me, who couldn't afford anywhere better. The kind of transient community where people keep to themselves and mind their own business. The flat directly below mine was occupied by someone I rarely saw. Occasionally, I'd glimpse a middle-aged man in the communal entrance, always carrying heavy bags or equipment cases. He kept odd hours and seemed to have frequent visitors, but in a building full of creative types working irregular schedules, that wasn't unusual. I knew him only as the name on the buzzer, M. Patterson. The first time I noticed something strange was about 6 months after moving in. I was working late on my laptop when I heard what sounded like someone crying through the floor. Not ordinary crying. Desperate, terrified sobbing that lasted for several minutes before stopping abruptly. I assumed it was an argument between Patterson and a partner, the kind of domestic situation you pretend not to hear in shared buildings. Over the following weeks, similar sounds occurred regularly, always late at night, always brief, always stopping suddenly, sometimes crying, sometimes what sounded like pleading or distressed conversation. The sounds were muffled by the concrete floor, but clear enough to be disturbing. I considered complaining to the building management, but wasn't sure how to explain what I was hearing without sounding like I was spying on my neighbor. The noises gradually became more frequent and more varied. Heavy objects being moved around, electronic equipment humming constantly, what sounded like construction work happening at strange hours. Patterson seemed to have an unusual number of visitors, always arriving and leaving at night, always carrying equipment or large bags. One evening, I was coming home from work when I encountered Patterson in the stairwell. He was directing 2 other men who were carrying what appeared to be professional camera equipment up to his flat. When he saw me, he explained that he was a freelance videographer working on corporate training materials that required controlled lighting conditions. The explanation seemed reasonable, and it accounted for the equipment noises I'd been hearing. But the sounds that followed weren't consistent with normal video production. Instead of the steady hum of lights and cameras, I heard intermittent activity that suggested something more irregular was happening. Periods of intense activity followed by long silences. Sounds that suggested distress or conflict rather than professional filming. About a month later, I discovered what appeared to be the first concrete evidence of something wrong. I was taking rubbish to the communal bins when I found several items that had clearly come from Patterson's flat. Medical supplies, plastic sheeting, and cleaning products that seemed excessive for normal household use. The combination was disturbing, particularly given the sounds I'd been hearing. I started paying closer attention to the patterns of activity below. The sounds seemed to follow a schedule. Preparation phases involving equipment setup, periods of intense activity that included the distressing human sounds, followed by cleanup periods that often lasted until dawn. The pattern repeated roughly once a week, always at night, always following the same sequence. One night, curiosity got the better of me. During what sounded like a preparation phase, I went down to the communal garden behind the building and looked up at Patterson's windows. They were covered with blackout material, but I could see the edges of bright lighting equipment around the frames. What disturbed me more was seeing cables running from his windows to a small satellite dish I hadn't noticed before. The next morning, I found Patterson in the communal entrance and casually asked about his video work. He was more forthcoming than I expected, explaining that he specialized in niche content for international clients. He mentioned working with subjects who required discretion and privacy, hence the soundproofing and security measures he'd installed. He also mentioned that his work required high-speed internet connections and specialized broadcasting equipment, When I asked about the satellite dish, Patterson explained that his clients demanded secure, encrypted transmission methods that standard internet connections couldn't provide. He said he used dark web protocols to ensure client confidentiality and protect the privacy of his subjects. The explanation sounded professional, but something about his manner suggested he was being deliberately vague. Over the following days, I researched dark web broadcasting and discovered information about red rooms, allegedly live-stream torture or murder where viewers could pay to watch or influence events. Most sources insisted they were urban legends, but some suggested they might exist using sophisticated encryption and cryptocurrency payment systems to avoid detection. The timing coincided with an escalation in the sounds from Patterson's flat. The preparation phases became longer and more complex. The periods of distress became more intense and extended. The cleanup phases seemed to involve more thorough work, including what sounded like industrial cleaning equipment. I also noticed changes in the building's internet connectivity. During Patterson's active periods, the shared Wi-Fi became unreliable, suggesting he was using substantial bandwidth for upload activity. When I mentioned this to other residents, they confirmed experiencing similar issues, always at night, always coinciding with increased activity from Patterson's flat. 2 weeks ago, everything changed. I was lying in bed around midnight when I heard sounds that were unmistakably different from the usual pattern. Instead of the typical preparation noises, I heard what sounded like a struggle, followed by someone calling for help in a voice that carried clearly through the floor. The sound suggested someone was in immediate danger. I called the police, reporting a possible domestic violence situation. They arrived within minutes and spoke to Patterson, who calmly explained that he was editing audio for a documentary about crime victims. He showed them his professional equipment and credentials and played samples of the audio he claimed to be working with. The officers seemed satisfied and left without further investigation. But Patterson knew I had called them. The next morning, I found a note pushed under my door, thanking me for my concern about the previous night's work. He explained that his documentary work sometimes involved distressing content that could be misinterpreted by neighbors. He assured me that everything was legitimate and suggested that we should discuss his work schedule to avoid future misunderstandings. When I met with Patterson that evening, he was surprisingly open about his activities. He explained that he produced specialized content for clients who paid premium rates for authentic, unscripted material. He said his work involved creating realistic scenarios that appeared genuine to viewers who were willing to pay substantial amounts for convincing performances. Patterson showed me some of his equipment, professional cameras, sophisticated lighting systems, and computer servers that he said were necessary for secure broadcasting to international clients. He explained that his subjects were paid performers who specialized in creating convincing distress reactions for discerning audiences who could distinguish between authentic and simulated content. The explanation addressed many of my concerns, but something still felt wrong. The sounds I heard didn't seem like performances. They carried an authenticity that suggested genuine fear and pain. When I mentioned this, Patterson explained that the most successful performers were those who could create truly convincing reactions, and that his clients paid premium rates specifically for content that seemed completely real. He also explained the dark web broadcasting setup, showing me how encrypted protocols and cryptocurrency payments allowed him to serve clients worldwide while maintaining their anonymity and his own security. He said this level of discretion was necessary because his content pushed boundaries that mainstream platforms wouldn't accept. Patterson concluded our conversation by mentioning that he was always looking for new performers who could create authentic reactions. He said the work paid extremely well for people who could handle intense scenarios convincingly. He suggested that if I was ever interested in supplementing my marketing income, he could arrange an audition. I declined, but Patterson's offer stayed with me. The marketing work wasn't paying enough to cover rising London rents, and the money he mentioned was substantial. Over the following days, I found myself considering his proposition, particularly when I heard what sounded like another successful session from his flat. Last week, I finally agreed to meet with Patterson about potential work. He explained that his current project involved creating content for a very specific audience that paid extraordinary amounts for authentic-seeming material. He said new performers typically started with minor roles to build comfort and confidence before progressing to more intensive scenarios. Patterson showed me the contracts his performers signed, which included substantial payment terms, confidentiality clauses, and detailed consent agreements. Everything appeared professional and legitimate. He explained that the intense reactions I'd been hearing were the result of method acting techniques that helped performers create convincing distress responses. He offered me what he called a trial role, a simple scenario that would pay enough to cover several months of rent. The work would involve a few hours of filming, following a script designed to create authentic-seeming reactions for his discerning clientele. He assured me that everything was performance, that safety protocols were in place, and that I could withdraw at any time if I became uncomfortable. I agreed to the trial, scheduled for tomorrow night. Patterson explained that the session would be broadcast to his regular audience, who had been informed about the new performer and were particularly interested in authentic reactions from first-time participants. He said the audience engagement was part of what made his content valuable. Viewers felt they were witnessing genuine experiences rather than obvious performances. But yesterday, I made a discovery that changed everything. While Patterson was out, I managed to access the building's Wi-Fi router and examine the network traffic from his flat. The data streams were massive, far larger than normal video files, and were being transmitted to multiple dark web addresses simultaneously. More disturbing was what I found when I managed to access one of these addresses through a Tor browser. Instead of the professional performance content Patterson had described, I found myself looking at what was clearly a red room operation. Live streams of genuine torture and murder, with chat functions allowing viewers to request specific actions through cryptocurrency payments. The archives showed dozens of previous broadcasts, all apparently filmed in Patterson's flat, all featuring people who displayed genuine terror and pain rather than convincing acting. These weren't performances, they were real victims, and I had been listening to their final moments through my floorboards for months. I realized that Patterson's offer wasn't for acting work. Tomorrow night's trial role was scheduled to be my final performance, broadcast live to thousands of dark web viewers who were expecting to watch someone die in the flat below mine. I've been hiding in a hotel since making this discovery, but Patterson keeps finding ways to contact me. Messages on social media, emails to accounts he shouldn't know about, even notes left at my workplace, all reminding me about tomorrow's commitment and explaining that his audience has been told to expect a new performer with authentic reactions. This morning, I found a package at my hotel room containing a tablet computer. When I turned it on, it showed a live feed of my empty flat, apparently filmed from Patterson's unit below. Text on the screen explained that the audience was already gathering for tomorrow's broadcast and that my non-appearance would disappoint viewers who had paid premium rates for the session. The message also included details about my daily routines, my workplace, my family's addresses, information that made it clear they had been monitoring me far longer than I realized. The final line explained that tomorrow's broadcast would happen regardless of my cooperation. The only question was whether I would be conscious for it. I'm writing this from another hotel, but I know they'll find me again. Patterson's operation is too sophisticated, too well-resourced, too experienced at managing unwilling participants. I've heard too many of their victims through my floorboards to believe I can escape the same fate. Tomorrow night, thousands of people on the dark web will watch a live stream from the flat below mine. They've paid in cryptocurrency to see authentic reactions from someone who doesn't know what's really happening until it's too late. They've been promised genuine terror and pain rather than acted performances. The most horrifying realization is that I've been living above a dark web red room for over a year, listening to people die while assuming they were just neighbors arguing or filming amateur videos. I've been an unwitting witness to dozens of murders, dismissing genuine cries for help as domestic disputes or creative projects. How many other people might be living above or next to similar operations? How many strange noises do we ignore because we don't want to get involved? How many victims have called for help through thin walls and floors, only to have neighbors assume it's just part of urban living? The dark web has made it possible for these operations to exist anywhere, hidden in plain sight, broadcasting horror to paying audiences, while neighbors remain oblivious to what's happening around them. The technology makes it easy to hide, to pay anonymously, to consume murder as entertainment. I should have trusted my instincts about those sounds, should have called police sooner, should have investigated more thoroughly instead of minding my own business, should have realized that genuine distress sounds different from acting or arguments. But it's too late for should-haves now. Tomorrow night, I'll probably become another voice crying through floorboards that someone else will dismiss as just neighborhood noise. Whether I show up willingly or they come to collect me, tomorrow's broadcast will feature the neighbor who lived upstairs and listened to all the previous victims without understanding what he was hearing. And somewhere above us, another neighbor will probably assume my screams are just someone having a bad night. I never wanted to share this story. Even now, as I type this out at 3 a.m. with my blinds drawn tight, I keep second-guessing myself. But after what happened last week, after seeing that familiar username pop up in my email, I realized I need to put this somewhere. Maybe as a warning. Maybe just to convince myself I'm not going mad. I've always been the tech guy in my friend group. The one people call when their laptop's acting up or when they need help setting up their new smart TV. It started back when I was 13, taking apart my dad's old computers in our garage in Manchester. My parents thought it was just a phase, but computers made sense to me in a way people never did. I was that quiet kid who'd rather debug code than go to parties. Not exactly the most exciting childhood, but it led me down some interesting paths. University was when things really took off. I studied computer science at Leeds, and while everyone else was out getting plastered at the student union, I'd be in my room exploring the furthest corners of the internet. It wasn't just about the coding challenges or the hacking forums, though those were fascinating enough. I was curious about what else was out there, beyond the surface web most people never venture past. That curiosity is what led me to the dark web in my second year. Looking back, I wish I could go back and slap some sense into my younger self. I thought I was being so clever, so edgy, setting up Tor, finding those first .onion links, feeling like I was some kind of digital explorer. It's embarrassing now, how proud I was of myself. Like I'd discovered some secret club. I wasn't doing anything particularly dodgy at first, just browsing, looking at some marketplaces out of curiosity, reading forums where people discuss privacy and security. I remember telling myself that I was just there for academic reasons, to understand the full landscape of the internet. That's what we tell ourselves, isn't it? That we're just observers, not participants, that we can look without being touched by what we see. I'd been exploring for about 6 months when I came across a link on one of the forums. Someone had posted it with a cryptic message for those with stronger stomachs than mine. No other context, no explanation. I should have left it alone. I knew even then that there were corners of the dark web no one should visit. But there was something about the way it was phrased, like a challenge. And I'd always had trouble walking away from a challenge. It was a Tuesday night in November. I remember because my flatmates had gone to see some horror film at the cinema. Ironic, considering what I was about to witness was far worse than any fictional horror. They'd invited me along, but I'd claimed I had coursework to finish. In reality, I just wanted a few hours alone to explore without anyone looking over my shoulder. My room was small, with just enough space for a bed and a desk crammed under the window. The streetlight outside cast an orange glow through the cheap blinds, making patterns on my keyboard as I clicked the link and waited for the page to load. Tor is notoriously slow, and I remember drumming my fingers, wondering if the link was dead. Maybe part of me was hoping it wouldn't load at all. When it finally did, it looked underwhelming at first. A black background, a simple login page with no graphics or explanations. Just a username and password field, and below it, a button that said Observe. No option to register that I could see. I was about to close it when I noticed a small line of text at the bottom. Guests welcome for preview only. I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to close the browser and forget I'd ever seen this page. But that damn curiosity, it's like an itch you can't help scratching, even when you know it'll make things worse. I moved my cursor to the Observe button and clicked. The screen went black for a moment, then loaded what looked like a streaming video. The quality was poor, grainy, and with a slight delay, like CCTV footage. It showed a room, empty, except for a metal table in the center. The walls were concrete, and there was a drain in the floor. My first thought was that it was some kind of industrial space, maybe an abandoned building. Then I noticed the tools arranged neatly on a tray beside the table. Scalpels, pliers, things I couldn't even identify. My stomach dropped. I knew I should close the browser immediately, but I was frozen, hoping this was just some elaborate setup for a prank or a very convincing piece of performance art. That's when I noticed the chat window on the right side of the screen, messages scrolling by too quickly to read properly. Anonymous users I didn't recognize, typing in a mix of languages. I caught fragments in English asking when it would start, commenting on previous sessions, preparing requests for what would happen next. It reminded me of those live gaming streams my flatmate would watch, except there was something soulless and predatory about the way these messages moved, like digital vultures circling. I felt sick. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hoax, a shocking display put on to scare people or to scam them out of money. I remember adjusting my position in my chair. The cheap foam cushion had gone flat after too many all-night coding sessions. My neck was stiff. I always got tense when I was anxious, a habit since childhood that my mum used to point out. But then a door opened on screen, and two figures entered the room. One was wearing a plain white mask that covered their entire face, dressed in what looked like surgical scrubs. The other, God, I still see them in my nightmares, was a young man, maybe in his 20s, with tape over his mouth and his hands bound behind his back. His eyes were wild with terror as he was forced onto the table. I should have closed the browser then. I should have reported it to someone, though I had no idea who would have jurisdiction over something like this. Instead, I sat there, telling myself it couldn't be real, even as the chat window exploded with activity. Users were placing what looked like bids, specifying what they wanted to see done. The messages contained horrific requests, starting with extremities, avoiding facial damage initially, grotesque suggestions about the victim's eyes. My throat went dry as I read them. I remember my hand hovering over the trackpad, trembling slightly. The heating in my room had kicked on, that familiar clicking sound as the radiator warmed up, such a normal, everyday sound that felt completely at odds with the horror unfolding on my screen. I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. Not in real life, not with me watching. I told myself it was an elaborate fake, that the person on the table was an actor, that the blood that began to flow when the masked figure made the first cut wasn't real. But deep down, I knew. The screams that came through my headphones weren't acted. The terror in that young man's eyes wasn't performed. I finally snapped out of my horrified trance and slammed my laptop shut. I ran to the bathroom and vomited until there was nothing left. When I came back, shaking, I opened my computer again, not to watch, but to figure out how to report what I'd seen. But the page was gone, redirecting to an error message. I tried the link again, but it was dead. For days afterwards, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that room, that table, those tools. I told myself there was nothing I could have done. I had no way of knowing where it was happening. No way to identify the people involved. I tried to convince myself it might have been fake after all. People can do amazing things with special effects these days, right? But I knew the truth. I'd seen something real, something horrific, and I'd done nothing but watch. I nearly dropped out of university. I stopped going to lectures, stopped talking to friends. My flatmates thought I was having some kind of breakdown, which I suppose I was. I formatted my hard drive and reinstalled everything, paranoid that somehow I'd been tracked, that whoever ran that site knew who I was and what I'd seen. After a few months, I started to recover. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that I'd never go near the dark web again. I focused on finishing my degree, got a job at a cybersecurity firm in London, built a normal life. I almost managed to convince myself that night had been some kind of fever dream, until last week. I was working late, alone in my flat. These days, I keep normal hours, have a girlfriend, go to the pub with colleagues, all the things normal people do. But sometimes I still stay up too late, coding or gaming or just browsing Reddit. It was around 1 a.m. when the email arrived. It came to my personal account, not the one I use for work. The subject line was just a string of numbers. The sender's address was a jumble of letters and digits that didn't look like any standard email format. I should have deleted it as spam, but something made me open it. There was no message, just a link, and below it, a single line stating they'd missed me, followed by an observer number I'd never seen before. I'd never used that identifier anywhere. It wasn't something I'd created or chosen, but as soon as I saw it, I knew. It was what they'd called me on that site. It was the automatic observer ID assigned to me when I'd clicked that button. I remember the room suddenly feeling colder, like someone had left a window open in December. My ears started to ring slightly, that same feeling I'd get before a panic attack during my university finals. I should have called someone, maybe my friend David, who works in digital security. but something kept me frozen in place. They knew who I was. They'd known all along. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely move the mouse, but I managed to delete the email. I shut down my computer, unplugged it from the wall. Childish, perhaps, but it was all I could think to do. I spent the rest of the night pacing my flat, jumping at every sound, checking the locks on my door and windows over and over. The next day, another email arrived, this time on my work account. Same subject line, same sender. I deleted it without opening it, then spent the day looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. I kept checking my reflection in my monitor screen, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The office felt different somehow. Spaces I'd walked through 1,000 times suddenly seemed threatening, filled with shadows and blind corners. The walk to the bathroom felt like crossing a minefield. When I got home, there was a third email waiting. On an old university account I hardly ever check anymore. This one had a message telling me it was my last chance, mentioning they had something special planned just for me. I didn't go to work the next day, or the day after that. I called in sick, turned off my phone, disconnected my router. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just some sick joke, someone who'd hacked my accounts. But then the letter arrived, an actual physical letter delivered to my flat. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with an address printed on it, an address less than a mile from where I live, and a time, tonight, 11 p.m. I've spent the day trying to figure out what to do. Go to the police and tell them what exactly? That years ago I watched something terrible on the dark web, and now I'm getting creepy emails. I have no proof, no evidence of any crime. Just my word, and the terrible feeling that somehow I've been marked. The rational part of my brain says to ignore it, to stay home, lock the doors, maybe go stay with a friend for a few days, until this blows over. But there's another part, the part that couldn't resist clicking that link all those years ago, that wonders. What if there's another victim? What if by going, I could somehow stop what happened before from happening again? Or what if it's a trap? What if I'm meant to be the next person on that table? It's 10:30 p.m. now. I have 30 minutes to decide. I keep telling myself I won't go, that only a madman would walk knowingly into what could be his own murder. But I also know that if I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to find me again. I've written this all down as a record, I suppose. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find it. Maybe they'll understand. Or maybe I'm just scaring myself over nothing. And tomorrow I'll read this back and laugh at how paranoid I've become. It's funny how the mind works. Last night I was worried about paying my council tax on time. And now here I am writing what might be my last words. The ordinary and the horrific side by side. I just remembered I was supposed to call my mum tomorrow for her birthday. I should have visited more often. There's a knock at my door. It's too early. It's only 10:33. No one should be here. I'm not expecting anyone. The knocking is getting louder, more insistent. I can hear voices outside, whispering. The letterbox just flapped open. Something's been pushed through, a white envelope, just like the one that came this morning. I don't want to open it. I don't want to know what's inside. But I also know I don't have a choice anymore. They found me. And judging by what I can see through my peephole, 3 figures in white masks waiting patiently. They're not planning to leave until they get what they came for. I'm going to stop writing now. I need to think about what to do next. If anyone reads this, well, I'm not sure what I expect you to do. Just know that there are corners of the internet where real nightmares live. And sometimes When you look into the darkness looks back and remembers your face. Silicon dreams have a way of blinding you to what's right in front of your eyes. The gleaming potential of innovation, the intoxicating rush of being part of something revolutionary. It creates a peculiar kind of tunnel vision that I now recognize as dangerous. My mother always said I was too trusting, too eager to see the best in people and situations. She wasn't wrong. That optimism nearly cost me everything when I joined Neurosync, the AI startup that promised to change how humans process information forever. I'd spent 4 years at Cambridge earning my computer science degree, followed by a soul-crushing 18 months coding banking software that paid well, but left me creatively starved. When the Neurosync recruiter approached me at a tech meetup in London, describing their vision of neural interface algorithms that could enhance human learning capacity, it felt like the universe was finally offering me a chance to do something meaningful. Their offices in Shoreditch occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick, polished concrete, and dramatic floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the open workspace with natural light. The kind of environment that makes you feel important just by existing within it. The interview process was grueling. 6 rounds of technical assessments, personality profiling, and strange hypothetical scenarios testing ethical boundaries. Looking back, I should have recognized those ethics questions as red flags, particularly the ones about privacy, surveillance, and the greater good. But I was dazzled by the founder, Victor Chen, a former neuroscientist turned tech visionary whose TED Talks had millions of views. His intense focus when he interviewed me personally made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, as if he recognized something in me that even I didn't fully understand. I started as a back-end developer on their core algorithm team, working punishing hours fueled by free gourmet meals and the cultish camaraderie that develops when a small group believes they're changing the world together. The company culture had all the startup cliches: meditation rooms, Friday drinking sessions, inspirational quotes painted on walls. But beneath that familiar veneer was something else, something I initially couldn't name, but felt as a subtle wrongness that I dismissed as imposter syndrome. The first concrete oddity I noticed was the server room on the restricted 3rd floor. Most startups use cloud services rather than maintaining extensive on-site infrastructure. But Neurosync had a substantial server farm that consumed enormous power and required dedicated cooling systems. When I asked about it, my team lead explained they needed physical servers for data security and proprietary hardware integration. It sounded plausible enough, though the biometric access protocol seemed excessive even for a security-conscious company. 3 months into my employment, I began noticing patterns in the network traffic that didn't align with our development activities. Massive data transfers occurred during odd hours, particularly between 2 and 4 a.m., creating noticeable system lag that affected our daytime work. When I mentioned this to my supervisor, his reaction was disproportionately severe. A flash of panic quickly masked by forced casualness, as he explained it away as automated backup procedures. My curiosity might have ended there if not for Eliza, our network security specialist, who pulled me aside after a team meeting with genuine fear in her eyes. She'd noticed the same anomalies, but had traced them further, discovering encrypted streams being broadcast through obscured channels to destinations she couldn't identify. She'd raised concerns directly with Chen and was immediately reassigned to a different project with restricted system access. Before she left, transferred suddenly to the Singapore office. She slipped me an access key and a hastily scribbled note about server cabinet B7. For 2 weeks, I did nothing with that key. My position at NeuroSync had become the cornerstone of my identity. I'd cut contact with friends who couldn't understand my dedication to work, moved to a flat within walking distance of the office, even begun dating another developer whose life was similarly consumed by the company. The thought of jeopardizing all that felt impossible, even as the strange network patterns continued and 3 more employees were abruptly relocated after asking the wrong questions. It was a system crash at 3:17 a.m. that finally compelled me to act. I'd been working late, alone in the office, when every monitor simultaneously went blank before rebooting. In that brief window of system vulnerability, I caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar interface momentarily displayed on my screen. A dark background with a red timer and what appeared to be a bidding panel. It vanished so quickly I might have imagined it, except for the split-second image that remained burned in my mind. A live video feed of what looked disturbingly like a person strapped to a chair in a sterile white room. That night, I used Eliza's key to access the server room, while the cleaning crew provided cover for my presence in the building. Cabinet B7 was segregated from the others, connected to independent power supplies and cooling systems. The servers themselves were standard hardware, but attached to them was custom equipment I didn't recognize. Components with no manufacturer logos, sophisticated transmission devices, and most alarmingly, a standalone storage system containing what appeared to be thousands of hours of video files with alphanumeric labels instead of conventional file names. I downloaded several files onto an encrypted drive, heart pounding so violently I feared it might trigger the motion sensors. Back at my flat, behind locked doors, and with my network connection disabled, I accessed the first file. What I saw destroyed every illusion I'd maintained about NeuroSync's noble mission. The footage showed exactly what I'd glimpsed during the system crash, a person restrained in a clinical setting. But this was no medical procedure or consensual research. The room was designed like a sterile stage set, with perfect lighting capturing every detail as masked figures systematically tortured the struggling subject. Overlaid on the video was the interface I'd glimpsed, a bidding system where unseen viewers could pay in cryptocurrency to determine what happened next, with a chat sidebar discussing the performance in grotesquely technical terms. I forced myself to watch 3 more videos, each featuring different victims in the same room, each following a similar pattern of escalating violence directed by remote bidders. In the background of one, a distinctively shaped light fixture was visible, identical to the designer installations in NeuroSync's executive conference room. These horrors weren't happening in some distant location. They were occurring inside our building, possibly on the sealed executive floor above the main workspace. The sickening realization crystallized all at once. The true product of NeuroSync wasn't neural interface technology. That was merely the public-facing operation that provided cover and funding for their actual business. A sophisticated dark web platform streaming interactive torture and murder to paying clients worldwide. The enormous server capacity, the odd hours network activity, the excessive security measures, all of it supported this nightmare hidden beneath the glossy veneer of innovation. I spent the night paralyzed by indecision, oscillating between calling the police immediately and recognizing the depth of evidence I would need to overcome the company's resources and connections. By morning, I'd formulated a plan to gather more concrete proof, to document everything systematically before taking it to authorities. I showered, dressed, and headed to the office as usual, the encrypted drive securely hidden in my apartment. The moment I badged into the building, I knew something was wrong. Security guards I'd never seen before stood by the lifts. My team lead intercepted me before I reached my desk, explaining that Chen wanted to see me immediately about a network security concern they'd detected overnight. As we rode the lift to the executive floor, an area I'd never accessed before, cold dread settled in my stomach. They knew. Chen's office was minimalist and cold, all glass and steel with views across London's skyline. He sat calmly behind a desk that probably cost more than my annual salary, flanked by two men whose stance and watchful eyes suggested backgrounds in something other than software development. With perfect composure, Chen explained that they detected my unauthorized server access, my file download, my violation of the confidentiality agreements I'd signed. He spoke of disappointment rather than anger, of necessary consequences for betrayal of trust. What followed was a proposal so casual in its monstrousness that I briefly wondered if I was hallucinating. Chen explained that NeuroSync's public business was merely a developmental phase. The real innovation lay in what he called experiential content, pushing the boundaries of human experience through unfiltered reality broadcast to select audiences. The neural interface technology wasn't separate from this. It was its ultimate evolution, creating direct sensory connections between paying clients and unwilling subjects. My technical skills made me valuable enough to offer a choice: join their inner operation with substantially increased compensation, or become content for it. As he outlined these options, a screen on his wall displayed a live feed of my flat, of the encrypted drive's hiding place, of my parents' home in Manchester. The message was clear. They controlled every aspect of my reality. I'd like to say I took the moral high ground, that I refused outright and accepted the consequences. The truth is more complicated and shameful. I hesitated. For 17 excruciating seconds, I actually considered the offer, mentally calculating survival probabilities, wondering if I could gather evidence from the inside, telling myself noble lies about infiltration and justice. Chen watched this internal struggle with clinical interest, as if my ethical crisis was itself a form of entertainment. What saved me wasn't courage, but circumstance. A notification on Chen's computer diverted his attention momentarily. Some issue with their broadcast server requiring immediate resolution. He instructed one of his associates to escort me to a holding room until he could continue our conversation. As we moved through a minimalist corridor, a building-wide power fluctuation caused the lights to dim briefly. My escort instinctively checked his earpiece communication, creating a momentary distraction. I ran, through a fire exit, down emergency stairs, triggering alarms that actually worked in my favor by creating confusion. I emerged into Shoreditch's late morning bustle and didn't stop running until I reached Liverpool Street Station, losing myself in the commuter crowd. I abandoned my phone, my laptop, every device that could be traced, and used a stranger's mobile to call the one person I trusted absolutely, my former cybersecurity professor who had government connections. The investigation that followed moved with agonizing slowness, hampered by NeuroSync's political influence and technological countermeasures. By the time authorities gathered enough evidence for action, the primary servers had been wiped clean, key executives had disappeared overseas, and Chen himself had vanished completely. They found the broadcasting studio hidden behind biometric locks on the executive floor, forensic evidence confirming what had happened there. But the victims remained unidentified, their digital ghosts haunting encrypted channels beyond conventional reach. 3 years later, I live under a different name in a different country, working IT for a small manufacturing firm that still uses physical paperwork for sensitive information. I've testified in closed hearings, signed countless governmental secrecy agreements, and spent hundreds of hours in therapy trying to reconstruct a sense of normalcy. Sometimes I almost succeed. But late at night, when sleep evades me, I remember Chen's expression as he outlined my options, not malicious or sadistic, but genuinely curious, as if my moral anguish was simply another form of data to collect. And I wonder how many other brilliant startups with charismatic founders and revolutionary promises are hiding similar horrors behind their sleek interfaces and inspirational mission statements, offering technological salvation with one hand while recording our most private moments with the other, transforming human suffering into content for those wealthy and depraved enough to consume it. The most terrifying realization isn't that monsters exist. It's that they wear wireless earbuds, quote philosophers on Instagram, and raise billions in venture capital, and that we willingly invite them into every aspect of our lives, mesmerized by the promise of a better, more connected future, while they quietly claim terminal access to our humanity. I never meant to find it. That's important to understand. I was just a bored software developer working from my flat in Manchester, running tests on a new algorithm designed to filter illegal content from social media platforms. It was a contract job for a mid-sized tech company, good money, flexible hours, and the sort of work that looks impressive on a CV. The kind of opportunity you don't question too deeply. My algorithm was supposed to identify and flag videos containing violence, abuse, or other prohibited content before they could be uploaded. Nothing revolutionary, just an improvement on existing systems. I needed sample data to test it, so the company gave me access to a secure server containing thousands of videos that had been previously removed from their platform. Most were exactly what you'd expect: fights, animal cruelty, dangerous stunts gone wrong. The algorithm handled these easily, assigning risk scores with over 95% accuracy compared to human moderators. But there were outliers, videos that humans had flagged, but my system missed entirely. These were the ones I needed to focus on to improve the detection rates. One particular video kept slipping through. The file name was just a string of numbers and letters, and according to the metadata, 6 different human moderators had flagged it for immediate removal, each citing different reasons. When I finally reviewed it myself, I was confused. It showed an empty room with white walls, a concrete floor, and a single metal chair in the center. Nothing happened for nearly 3 minutes. No people, no movement. Just static footage of an empty room. The video quality was poor, with occasional digital artifacts, compression issues most likely. I ran it through the algorithm again with different parameters, but it consistently received a low-risk score. I noted this as an anomaly and moved on to other samples. But that night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about it. Why had 6 moderators independently flagged an empty room? What were they seeing that both I and my algorithm had missed? The next morning, I downloaded the video file and examined it more carefully. The metadata contained an unusual string in the creator field, what looked like an onion address, the kind used on Tor networks. Out of professional curiosity, I accessed Tor through a secure virtual machine and entered the address. It led to a black screen with a simple login form and a counter displaying 4,291. As I watched, the number increased to 4,292. The site offered no explanation of what this counter represented. No context, no identifying information, just a login form and that steadily increasing number. I closed the browser and returned to my work. I had deadlines to meet, and mysterious websites weren't relevant to improving my algorithm. I modified the code to better detect empty rooms with strange metadata and moved on to other test cases. 3 days later, I received an email from an address consisting of random characters. The subject line was the same string of numbers and letters as the video file name. The body contained only a username and password, followed by the words, "Observer access granted." I should have deleted it immediately, should have reported it to the company's security team. Instead, I saved the information and continued working as if nothing had happened. That night, after a few glasses of wine, I reopened my secure virtual machine, accessed the .onion address, and entered the credentials. The site loaded to show the same empty room from the video, but now as a live feed. The counter in the corner showed 7,843. A chat window occupied the right side of the screen, messages scrolling by too quickly to read properly. From what I could gather, users were discussing preparations for something called an event. Some were placing what appeared to be bets using cryptocurrency. In the bottom left corner was a countdown timer. 47 hours, 12 minutes, and 36 seconds. Just under 3 days. I watched for about 20 minutes. Nothing changed in the room. The chat continued with discussions I couldn't fully follow, filled with abbreviations and terminology I didn't recognize. I logged out, shut down the virtual machine, and tried to forget about it. The next day, I received another email from a different random address. This one contained only a postcode, my postcode, and the message, confirmation required for observer status. I immediately strengthened all my security settings, changed passwords, and ran multiple malware scans. Everything came back clean. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence or a scare tactic used by whatever strange corner of the internet I'd stumbled into. Still, I deleted the virtual machine and resolved to focus solely on my work. That evening, my doorbell rang. When I checked through the peephole, no one was there. But on the ground was a small package wrapped in brown paper with no postage or shipping labels. Inside was a cheap mobile phone, switched off, with a handwritten note containing just a time, 2000 hours. Against my better judgment, I turned on the phone at the specified time. It immediately connected to a network I didn't recognize and opened to a video feed. The same room, the same angle, but now the chair was occupied. A person sat there, head covered by a black hood, hands secured behind their back. The counter now showed 12,574 and was increasing rapidly. The chat window was moving so fast it was just a blur of text. The countdown timer read 0031 minutes 8 seconds, 31 minutes. I wanted to turn it off, to throw the phone away, but I couldn't look away. I told myself I needed to know what this was, what I had inadvertently become involved with. At exactly 20:30, a figure entered the frame wearing a featureless white mask and surgical gloves. They carried a small tray of implements I couldn't clearly identify. The masked figure approached the bound person and held up what looked like a scalpel to the camera. The chat suddenly slowed, and a message appeared in red. Bidding begins. Choose location. I switched off the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I understood now what I had found, what the algorithm had failed to detect, what those 6 human moderators had recognized from experience. The empty room wasn't just an empty room. It was a stage being set. I spent the night researching red rooms, supposedly live-stream torture or murder that viewers could pay to watch or even direct. Most credible sources insisted they were urban myths, technically impossible to stream securely. But what if the conventional wisdom was wrong? What if someone had found a way to make it work? I needed to report this to the authorities, but I had a problem. I had accessed the site. I had watched. My digital fingerprints were all over this, and I had no way to prove I had stumbled onto it innocently. I decided to gather more evidence before coming forward. The next day, I returned to work and began examining other videos that had slipped past my algorithm, but been flagged by human moderators. There were 5 more showing empty rooms, each with different layouts, but similar empty chairs. Each file contained hidden .onion addresses in the metadata. That evening, another package arrived at my door. This one contained a USB drive. When I checked it on a secure system, it contained a single video file. It showed the complete event from the previous night. I couldn't watch more than a few seconds before shutting it down. But in those seconds, I saw enough to know this was real. These weren't actors. This wasn't simulated. And according to the counter, over 15,000 people had watched it happen. I decided to go to the police the next morning. I would turn over everything I had found and face whatever consequences came with it. I spent the night copying evidence to an external drive and writing a detailed account of how I had discovered the site. I woke to the sound of an email notification. The subject line was "Observer status revoked." The body contained my full name, address, and a photograph of me sleeping in my bed, taken from inside my flat, hours earlier. Below the photo was a message: "Participant status pending. Current bids, 18 inches. I left immediately with just my wallet and phone, checked into a hotel on the other side of the city using cash, spent the day moving between public places, trying to figure out what to do. That evening, I returned to the hotel to find the door to my room slightly ajar. Inside, everything appeared untouched except for the television, which was turned onto a blank screen with a counter, 23,109. I packed up again and left, taking a night bus to Leeds, found another hotel, tried to sleep, woke to find my new room's mirror had fogged up despite no one using the shower. Written in the condensation was a set of coordinates and a time, 2 days from now. I looked up the coordinates. They pointed to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of Birmingham. I've been moving constantly since then, different cities, different hotels, always paying cash. I've disposed of my original phone, bought and discarded several burners. Each time I think I've broken the pattern, I find evidence they found me. A note slipped under a door, a message written on a receipt, a counter displayed on a digital screen as I walk past. The most terrifying part is not knowing how they keep finding me, or who they even are. Is it one person, a group? Is it the thousands of observers, some percentage of whom are actively tracking me? I've examined my clothing for tracking devices, checked for implants under my skin, scanned for rogue wireless signals. Nothing. 3 hours ago, I received a text on my newest phone, one that no one should have the number for. Final preparations underway. Broadcast begins 2100. Viewer count 41,863. I'm writing this in a library in Glasgow using a public computer. I've been on trains, buses and taxis continuously for the past 48 hours. I haven't slept, barely eaten. I'm running out of cash, options and places to hide. I've come to a terrible realization. What I discovered wasn't just a red room. It was an entire ecosystem built around them. My algorithm wasn't failing to detect prohibited content. It was being trained to deliberately ignore it. The company that hired me wasn't trying to remove this content. They were developing sophisticated methods to hide it in plain sight. The contract job, the test videos, the access to the secure server, it was all a setup. They weren't assessing the algorithm's ability to detect prohibited content. They were assessing me, my reaction, my moral flexibility, my potential as either an asset to their operation or a threat to be eliminated. And I failed their test by showing too much curiosity, by looking too closely at what I was meant to overlook. The most disturbing part is how vast this network must be. The resources required to track someone across multiple cities, to always be one step ahead, to have eyes everywhere. It suggests organization and reach that goes beyond what any ordinary criminal enterprise should be capable of. I wonder how many other programmers, content moderators, and data analysts have been pulled into this system. How many recognized what I failed to see and chose to look the other way? How many became observers rather than raising alarms? How many are watching now? I have less than 6 hours until the scheduled broadcast. The counter likely shows over 50,000 by now. 50,000 people waiting to watch what happens to me. I've considered turning myself in to the police, but what if some of them are connected to this network? The level of coordination I've witnessed suggests infiltration of normal systems. Who can I trust? I keep thinking about those other empty rooms I found in the test videos. How many people have sat in those chairs? How many more will follow? And was I selected randomly? Or is there something specific about me that made them choose me as the next subject? I don't know if anyone will believe this account. It sounds paranoid, even to me as I write it. But I know what I've seen. I know what's hunting me. I'm going to post this and then head to the train station. I have a plan to get to a remote village in the Scottish Highlands where a former colleague has a holiday cottage. No internet, no mobile service. Maybe if I can stay off the grid long enough, they'll select another target, move on to someone else. That's the final horror of this system. The knowledge that my only hope for survival may be that someone else takes my place in that chair, that the observer's attention shifts to another victim, that the algorithm selects a new participant. The idea makes me sick, but I'm out of alternatives. If you're reading this and you work in content moderation, data filtering, or AI development, pay attention to what your systems are being trained to ignore. Look closer at the empty rooms. Ask questions about the files everyone seems to overlook. And if you ever receive an email offering observer status, delete it immediately. Don't let curiosity lead you where it led me. The broadcast is scheduled for 2100 hours tonight. I have no intention of being in front of a camera. But as I've learned over these past terrible days, my intentions may no longer matter. Picture this. You're going through life, you have a few close friends, you're relatively happy and all is well. Then, one day, you borrow your neighbor's internet connection and it changes everything. You never imagined it would lead you into the darkest corners of human behavior, that a simple act of digital trespassing could make you a witness to things that happen every day, just out of sight of people like us. I'm a night shift worker at a 24-hour Tesco in Birmingham, have been for the past 2 years, stocking shelves and dealing with the occasional drunk customer between midnight and 8 in the morning. It's not glamorous work, but it pays enough to cover the rent on my studio flat and leaves my days free for sleeping and not much else. The internet in my building has always been unreliable. The landlord installed the cheapest possible broadband years ago and hasn't upgraded it since. Most evenings when I'm trying to unwind before work, the connection drops out completely or slows to the point where even basic websites won't load properly. Around Christmas last year, I noticed that one of my neighbors had left their Wi-Fi network unsecured. The signal was strong enough to reach my flat, and the connection speed was significantly better than what I was paying for. I told myself I'd only use it temporarily, just until I could sort out proper internet service for myself. The network was called Deep Access 01, which seemed like an odd name for a home connection, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People choose strange names for their networks. I've seen everything from FBI surveillance van to pretty fly for a Wi-Fi in my building. For several weeks, everything worked perfectly. Better than perfectly, actually. The connection was faster and more stable than any internet service I'd ever used. I could stream videos without buffering, download files in seconds, browse multiple websites simultaneously without any noticeable slowdown. It was during one of these late-night browsing sessions that I first encountered something unusual. I was looking through Reddit, jumping between different communities, when I clicked on a link that seemed to take longer than usual to load. When the page finally appeared, it wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of the typical Reddit interface, I was looking at what appeared to be a directory listing. Rows of folders and files with cryptic names organized by date and time. It looked like the back end of a website, the kind of administrative interface that normal users aren't supposed to see. I assumed I'd clicked on a broken link or encountered some sort of server error, tried refreshing the page, but got a different view of the same type of directory structure. Different files, different folders, but the same basic layout. Most of the folder names were meaningless combinations of letters and numbers, but a few had descriptions that caught my attention. Things like archive sessions and live feeds and request queue. The file sizes were enormous, much larger than typical documents or images. Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on one of the folders labeled Archive Sessions. What opened was another directory, this one containing video files. Hundreds of them, organized by date and numbered sequentially. The file names didn't provide any information about their content, just timestamps and reference numbers. I selected one at random and clicked on it. The video opened in a basic media player, no fancy interface or streaming platform branding, just a simple window with standard playback controls. The video quality was surprisingly good, much better than I'd expected for files that seemed to be stored on someone's personal server. The content showed what looked like a basement or cellar. Concrete walls, minimal lighting, basic furniture. Someone was sitting in a chair in the center of the frame, though the image quality made it difficult to make out specific details about them. I watched for several minutes, waiting for something to happen. The person in the chair appeared to be unconscious or sleeping. No one else was visible in the frame, and there was no audio beyond a faint ambient hum. Eventually, I got bored and tried a different file. This one showed a different location, what might have been a garage or workshop. Similar setup, different person, same lack of activity. I began to suspect these were test recordings or placeholder content for some sort of streaming service. Over the next few evenings, I explored more of the directory structure, found folders containing what appeared to be live streaming software, payment processing systems, user management databases, everything you'd need to run a professional video platform, but hosted on what seemed to be a residential internet connection. The live streaming folder was particularly interesting. It contained software I'd never heard of, applications designed for anonymous broadcasting over encrypted networks. The documentation mentioned compatibility with Tor and other privacy-focused systems. That's when I started to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't just someone's personal media collection. This was the infrastructure for a dark web streaming service, the kind of platform I'd read about in forums, but assumed were mostly urban legends. I should have stopped exploring at that point. Should have disconnected from the network and pretended I'd never seen any of it. Instead, I kept digging deeper. Found a folder labeled Current Operations that contained what appeared to be real-time data. Server logs, user statistics, financial records. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of users, hundreds of thousands of pounds in cryptocurrency transactions, server costs that would make most small businesses bankrupt. The user logs showed people connecting from all over the world, accessing content at all hours of the day and night. The financial records indicated that viewers were paying significant amounts to access premium content, with additional fees for what the system described as interactive services. But it was the content scheduling system that made everything clear. A calendar showing planned streaming sessions, each one tagged with location details, participant information, and viewer capacity limits. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, like something you'd see in a corporate project management system. Except the projects being managed were real people, and the calendar showed that a session was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. I found the live streaming interface and accessed it using credentials I discovered in one of the configuration files. The platform looked professional, with a clean user interface and robust streaming capabilities. There was a chat system, payment processing, viewer analytics, everything you'd expect from a legitimate streaming service. The scheduled session appeared in the interface as Location 7, Premium Interactive, max 50 viewers. The stream wasn't active yet, but there was a countdown timer showing roughly 40 minutes until it began. I waited, telling myself I was just curious about the technical aspects of how such a system might work, that I was investigating out of professional interest, not personal entertainment. When the timer reached 0, the stream activated automatically. The video showed a room I hadn't seen in any of the archived files. Looked like someone's living room, complete with family photos, children's toys scattered about, the kind of domestic space where normal people lived normal lives. A man sat on the sofa, facing the camera. He was clearly awake and aware, looking directly into the lens with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite resignation, but something in between that suggested he understood exactly what was about to happen. The chat system activated as soon as the stream began. Messages appeared from viewers around the world, most of them numbers and brief phrases in various languages. Within minutes, there were nearly 50 people watching, all of them typing commands and instructions. That's when I realized what I was witnessing. This wasn't just a streaming service. It was an interactive platform where viewers could direct what happened to real people in real time. The chat messages weren't comments, they were orders. Someone entered the frame from off-camera. They were holding what looked like a tablet device, which they showed to the man on the sofa. He read whatever was displayed on the screen, and his expression changed from resignation to genuine terror. The chat messages became more frequent and specific. I started to understand that the viewers were voting on what should happen next, with the most popular suggestions being implemented by whoever was operating the camera. The man on the sofa looked directly at the camera again, and I realized he could see the viewer count. He knew exactly how many people were watching, knew that dozens of strangers were deciding his fate through an anonymous chat system. I closed the browser and unplugged my computer from the wall. Spent the next 3 days calling in sick to work, barely leaving my flat, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was some sort of elaborate performance art or psychological experiment. The production values had been too professional, the technical infrastructure too sophisticated for something genuinely criminal. But I couldn't stop thinking about the man's expression when he'd read that tablet, the way he'd looked through the camera, as if he could see directly to the people controlling what happened to him. Eventually, I contacted my internet service provider and arranged for proper broadband installation. Stopped using my neighbor's connection entirely, though I never figured out which flat it was coming from. The building has 12 units, and I've never been social enough with the other residents to know who might be running that kind of operation. I moved out 2 months later, found a different flat across town, told myself it was for completely unrelated reasons, better neighborhood, shorter commute to work, that sort of thing. But moving doesn't change what you know, and the questions followed me to the new address. Had I witnessed something real, or had I stumbled across an elaborate piece of interactive fiction? How do you verify something that exists entirely in the shadows, that leaves no trace in the legitimate world? That was nearly a year ago. I still work the night shift at Tesco, still live alone in a studio flat, still spend my evenings browsing the internet before work. But I've become much more careful about which networks I connect to, which links I click, which rabbit holes I'm willing to explore. Sometimes, usually when I'm stocking shelves during the quiet hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, I'll think about that countdown timer, about the professionalism of that streaming platform, the sophistication of the user interface, the global audience participating in real-time decision-making. The worst part isn't wondering whether what I saw was genuine. The worst part is knowing that somewhere right now, similar platforms are operating with similar audiences. And people like that man on the sofa are looking into cameras just like that one. And sometimes I wonder if my access to that network was really accidental. Whether someone in my building noticed my internet usage patterns and deliberately left their connection unsecured, knowing that someone like me would eventually find what they wanted me to find. Whether I was supposed to discover that platform, supposed to witness what I witnessed, supposed to carry that knowledge forward into my ordinary life as a night shift worker in Birmingham. I've never told anyone about this. Not colleagues, not friends, not the authorities. What would I say? That I used someone else's Wi-Fi and found something that might have been real? That I watched something terrible happen and then disconnected? But I'm telling you now, and I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because the weight of keeping it secret has become too much. Maybe because sharing it might somehow make it less real, less immediate, less present in my thoughts during those quiet hours at work. Or maybe because I've started to suspect that creating witnesses was always the point. That platforms like that don't just exist to serve their paying customers, but to generate people like me who carry the knowledge of what's possible in the spaces between legitimate internet services. People who understand that the surface web is exactly that, a surface, concealing activities that most people never imagine are happening, right alongside their Netflix subscriptions and social media feeds. Maybe by telling you this, I'm doing exactly what whoever runs Deep Access, 01, intended from the beginning. Maybe that's how these things spread and survived, through stories told by people who stumbled across them accidentally and can never quite forget what they saw. Maybe the real product isn't the streams themselves, but witnesses like me who carry the knowledge forward, who plant seeds of awareness in the minds of people who might otherwise never imagine such things exist. I still live in the same city, still work the same shifts, still browse the internet during my free time. But I've never again seen a network called Deep Access 01, and I've never again found directory structures like the ones I explored that winter. Sometimes I wonder if they're still operating from somewhere in my old building, still running streams for global audiences, still creating new witnesses who will carry their own versions of this story forward. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone with my computer, I catch myself looking for unsecured networks, wondering what I might find if I started exploring again. That's perhaps the most disturbing part of all. Not the horror of what I witnessed, but the lingering curiosity about what else might be out there, just a few clicks away from the ordinary internet that most people think they know. Have you ever had that moment when you realize you've been watching someone die and you can't tell if it's real or fake? That sick feeling in your stomach when you suddenly understand that what you thought was just morbid curiosity has turned you into something you never wanted to be. 6 weeks ago, I thought the most dangerous thing about the internet was accidentally clicking on spoilers for my favorite series. Now, I'm writing this from an internet cafe in Brighton, knowing that somewhere in the depths of the dark web, thousands of people are counting down the hours until they watch me become the next victim in a red room broadcast I accidentally stumbled into. The film that started everything was called The Deep Web, or something equally dramatic. It was one of those low-budget thrillers that Netflix suggests when you've watched everything decent. The plot was about a journalist investigating online crime networks and discovering live-streamed murders where viewers could pay to watch real people being tortured and killed. Classic horror film stuff, completely over the top. But it got me thinking about whether any of it was actually real. I'd heard whispers about the dark web at college, older students talking about how you could buy anything online if you knew where to look. Drugs, fake IDs, stolen credit card details, but live murder streams? That seemed like the sort of thing that only existed in films. Still, curiosity is a powerful thing when you're 16, and everything in your life feels predictable and boring. My older brother Tom had left his laptop behind when he moved out for university, and I'd been using it for coursework since mine broke. Tom was studying computer science, so his laptop was loaded with all sorts of software I didn't recognize. One evening, while procrastinating on a history essay, I started exploring the programs he'd installed. Most were incomprehensible programming tools, but one caught my attention, something that seemed designed for accessing hidden websites. I won't pretend I understood the technical details, but after some Googling and following online tutorials, I managed to access what people called the dark web. It wasn't as exciting as I'd expected. Most of it looked like outdated websites from the early 2000s, with basic layouts and clunky navigation. There were marketplaces selling illegal things, forums discussing topics I didn't want to read about, and lots of sites that seemed abandoned or fake. But after a few hours of browsing, I found something that made my heart race. A site advertising authentic experiences and real-time interactive content with view accounts that suggested thousands of people were accessing it. The layout was more professional than most dark web sites I'd seen, with slick graphics and detailed descriptions of upcoming events. The site was clearly advertising red rooms, live streams where viewers could watch real violence happen to real people. The descriptions were clinical and detached, discussing subjects and scenarios, as if they were describing a nature documentary. What disturbed me most was how organized it all seemed. This wasn't some amateur operation. It was a business with regular schedules, different pricing tiers, and customer reviews. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to see if these things were actually real. or just elaborate hoaxes designed to scam gullible people. I created an account using fake details and started lurking in the forums where users discussed upcoming broadcasts. The conversations were casual, almost mundane. People talking about their favorite performers and comparing the quality of different streaming services. Most discussions focused on something called verification, the process of proving that broadcasts were genuine rather than staged. Experienced users shared tips for spotting fake content and recommended verified streams that had been authenticated by the community. The level of detail was disturbing. People analyzing physiological responses, discussing the authenticity of fear reactions, comparing the realism of different scenarios. After several days of reading these forums, I was convinced that at least some of the content was real. The users were too knowledgeable, too specific in their discussions, too focused on distinguishing authentic material from performances. They were talking about genuine violence as if it were entertainment, rating different streams based on the authenticity of the victim's suffering. The turning point came when I received a private message from someone with an established account. They'd noticed I was new and offered to help me navigate the more exclusive areas of the site. They explained that the best content required invitation access and that they could sponsor my application if I was genuinely interested in authentic experiences. Against my better judgment, I accepted their offer. Within hours, I had access to areas of the site I hadn't known existed. Higher quality streams, more detailed victim profiles, and viewer interaction features that allowed audiences to influence what happened during broadcasts. The technology was sophisticated. Multi-camera angles, real-time chat systems, and payment processing that handled thousands of transactions simultaneously. I watched part of one stream before closing my laptop and being sick in the bathroom. What I saw was undeniably real. Genuine terror, authentic pain, actual violence happening to someone who wasn't acting. The chat was full of users requesting specific actions, discussing the victim's responses, and rating the stream's quality as if they were reviewing a restaurant. I should have stopped accessing the site immediately, should have deleted the browser and tried to forget what I'd seen. Instead, I found myself returning every few days, drawn by a combination of horror and fascination. I never participated in the chats or made requests, but I became a regular observer of something I knew was deeply wrong. The users began to recognize my account name. Some sent friendly messages welcoming me to the community and recommending their favorite streamers. Others shared tips for accessing even more exclusive content or invited me to private viewing groups. I was becoming integrated into a network of people who consumed real suffering as entertainment. About 3 weeks into my exploration of the site, I received a message that changed everything. Someone had noticed my viewing patterns and wanted to discuss a special opportunity. They explained that new viewers were sometimes selected for participation in broadcasts, transitioning from observer to subject based on their engagement with the community. The message included details about my browsing history, the streams I'd watched, and the forums I'd visited. They knew I was accessing the site from Croydon, that I was using my brother's laptop, and that I typically browsed late at night when my parents were asleep. The level of surveillance was terrifying. They'd been monitoring me without my knowledge. More disturbing was their explanation of how recruitment worked. They didn't kidnap random people off the street. Instead, they identified curious observers who had demonstrated interest in their content and gradually drew them into participation. People who had already compromised themselves by watching, who couldn't report what they'd seen without admitting their own involvement. The message concluded with an invitation to a special viewing event in London. They offered to pay for travel expenses and promised I'd get to see behind the scenes of a professional broadcast. They assured me it was just observational, a chance to understand how the productions worked, but something about the invitation felt like a trap. I ignored the message, but similar invitations kept arriving. Different users reaching out with variations of the same offer. Opportunities to attend live events, meet other community members, or tour production facilities. Each message demonstrated more detailed knowledge of my personal life, my college schedule, my part-time job at a local shop, my family's routines. 2 weeks ago, the messages became more insistent. Someone had accessed my social media accounts and was sending screenshots of my online activity, threatening to share my dark web browsing history with my parents, college, and friends, unless I accepted one of their invitations. They'd also found my real name, address, and mobile number despite my using fake details on the site. That's when I realized I wasn't just a viewer anymore. I was being groomed as a potential victim. The friendly welcome messages, the exclusive access, the gradual normalization of extreme content. It had all been designed to draw me deeper into their network until I became complicit enough to be vulnerable to coercion. I deleted everything from my brother's laptop, changed all my passwords, and tried to pretend none of it had happened. But the messages kept finding me on different platforms. Text messages to my phone, emails to accounts I'd never used for dark web access, even physical letters posted to my home address. All contained the same basic threat: participate willingly or face exposure of my viewing history. The most recent message arrived yesterday, delivered to the coffee shop where I work part-time. Someone had been watching me closely enough to know my schedule and workplace. The envelope contained photographs of me, taken without my knowledge over recent weeks, walking to college, leaving work, sitting in my bedroom at night. The accompanying note explained that my audition period was concluding and that I was expected to attend a filming session tomorrow evening. The location was an address in South London, along with detailed instructions about arrival times and what to bring. The note explained that my session would be broadcast live to the community members who'd been following my journey from curious observer to willing participant. They'd been documenting my gradual involvement, turning my exploration of their world into content for other viewers. I've been hiding in Brighton since receiving that message, but I know they'll find me again. They've demonstrated access to surveillance that goes far beyond what I thought possible. They know my habits, my routines, my vulnerabilities. They've been studying me for weeks, learning how to manipulate and control me. The most terrifying realization is that this was always the plan. The easy access to the site, the friendly welcome from established users, the gradual exposure to more extreme content. It was all designed to identify and recruit potential victims. The dark web red rooms don't just broadcast random violence, they cultivate their own supply of subjects from curious visitors who think they're just exploring. I keep thinking about how many other teenagers might be following the same path I did. How many young people, bored and curious about the stories they've heard, might be unknowingly walking into the same trap. The internet makes it so easy to access these spaces, to become involved without understanding the consequences. Tomorrow night, thousands of people on the dark web will expect to watch a live broadcast featuring the teenage girl who started as a curious observer and became the main attraction. They've been following my story, anticipating this conclusion, paying for access to see how my journey ends. I could go to the police, but what would I tell them? That I spend weeks voluntarily accessing illegal content on the dark web? That I watched real people being harmed and did nothing to help them? That I'm now being blackmailed to participate in the same activities I observed? any investigation would expose my own actions and probably result in criminal charges. The people running these operations understand this dynamic perfectly. They create viewers who become complicit through observation, who can't seek help without incriminating themselves, who gradually transform from audience to content. It's a perfect system for generating both entertainment and victims. I'm writing this as a warning for anyone who might be tempted to explore these areas of the internet out of curiosity or boredom. The dark web red rooms aren't just urban legends or film plots. They're real, they're organized, and they're always looking for new content. What starts as innocent curiosity can quickly become something much darker. Tomorrow's broadcast is supposed to feature a special guest, a teenage girl from Croydon who thought she was just exploring the internet and ended up becoming the star of her own horror story. The viewers are expecting authentic reactions, genuine fear, real consequences for someone who started as one of them. I don't know if I'll show up at that address tomorrow night or if I'll keep running. But I do know that somewhere in the depths of the dark web, people are waiting to watch whatever happens next. People who started as curious observers just like me, who gradually became consumers of real suffering, who now expect to see me transition from viewer to victim. The cycle continues, and curiosity remains the bait that draws in the next generation of participants. Sometimes the worst decisions really do start with boredom. Imagine if the biggest mistake in your life came from being curious about something you saw in a film. That's what happened to my nephew, Tom, and it's why I can't sleep properly anymore. He was 16, the kind of kid who spent his weekends helping his gran with her garden and riding his bike down to the harbour to watch the fishing boats come in. Not the sort you'd expect to get mixed up in something dark. But that's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't discriminate. It started last autumn when he watched some thriller at the cinema in Truro about people being kidnapped and forced to perform for online audiences. The film made it seem like these things actually happened, that there were websites hidden beneath the normal internet where people paid to watch terrible things in real time. Most adults would have dismissed it as Hollywood nonsense. But 16-year-olds don't have that filter yet. Tom lived with his mum in Polperro, one of those picture postcard Cornish villages where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is a tourist getting stuck in the narrow streets with a rental car. His dad had left when he was small, so it was just the two of them in a cottage overlooking the harbour. She worked at the local primary school and trusted him to be sensible while she was out. The trouble began when he started researching whether the film's premise was real. He found a Reddit thread discussing the movie, where users debated its authenticity. Most dismissed it as fiction, but a few claimed to know otherwise. One user posted a cryptic comment: "The rabbit hole goes deeper than Hollywood thinks. PM me if you're actually curious." Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He messaged the user, who responded with a YouTube link disguised as a tutorial for advanced internet privacy. The video seemed innocent enough. A bearded man in a basement explaining VPNs and encryption. But buried in the comments section were breadcrumbs, references to Tor, specific forum names, and invitation codes. It took him several weeks to work out how to access these hidden networks. The learning curve was steep, but he persisted, documenting his progress in a private Discord server he'd created. Looking back, that was his first mistake, creating a digital trail of his journey into the shadows. When he finally managed to connect, he spent hours exploring, fascinated by this parallel internet. Most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct forums, conspiracy sites, and pages that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. But he kept searching, following links and recommendations, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing the very type of content he'd seen in the film. Users shared links and recommendations with clinical detachment, discussing authenticity like film critics. Reading through the posts, he realized that what he thought was pure fiction might actually exist. The sites themselves were surprisingly primitive. Basic interfaces that looked like they'd been cobbled together by amateurs. Most required payments through complicated systems, but several offered preview sections that were freely available. The previews were disturbing enough. Grainy footage of people in windowless rooms, movements too natural to be acted, reactions too genuine to be scripted. What bothered him most was how organized it seemed, despite the amateur appearance. This wasn't random content uploaded by individuals. Someone was running a proper operation with regular schedules and systematic approach. The forums contained discussions about production quality, request systems, and expansion plans. From what he could gather, the operation was smaller than the film had suggested, but more real. It seemed to be an emerging network, testing methods and building capabilities rather than some vast established enterprise. The amateurish appearance was deliberate, designed to look like a few perverts with cameras rather than something more coordinated. The discussions revealed they were actively recruiting both participants and what they called local assets, people who could provide information about potential targets in their areas. They weren't just looking for victims. They needed intelligence gatherers, people who understood local dynamics and could spot opportunities. Tom's mistake was engaging with the forum using the same username he'd used elsewhere online. His digital footprint was surprisingly extensive. Gaming forums, social media, even school project submissions. Anyone looking could piece together his real identity, location, and interests within hours. The first sign they'd noticed him came through his Discord server. Files appeared that he hadn't uploaded. Screenshots of his own posts, maps of Polperro with his cottage marked, even photos of him taken from his school's website. Someone had been systematically cataloging his online presence. His laptop's webcam began activating randomly, the little light blinking on during the night. When he covered it, files on his desktop would be subtly altered, documents renamed, folders reorganized, photos edited with barely visible changes. They were demonstrating access to his digital life, showing him how completely they could invade his privacy. The psychological pressure was subtle but effective. His browsing history would be altered to include sites he'd never visited. His social media accounts would show login attempts from locations across the country. And his email would receive messages that seemed to know details about his daily routine. Sleep became almost impossible. He'd lie awake wondering if the webcam was recording, if his microphone was listening, if his every keystroke was being monitored. The laptop that had been his window to the world became a source of constant anxiety. The surveillance escalated when someone began asking questions about him in the village. His mum mentioned that a stranger had approached her at the school, claiming to be conducting research on rural internet infrastructure. The questions had been specifically about teenage online habits and computer literacy in the area. They'd identified him as potentially useful, a tech-savvy local teenager with detailed knowledge of the community, living in an area with limited police presence and isolated enough for discreet operations. But more than that, they needed a test subject for their Cornwall expansion, and Tom had unknowingly volunteered by documenting his journey into their world. The breakthrough came when he found evidence of their local operations. Forum posts discussed reconnaissance trips to Cornwall, photos of abandoned buildings within driving distance of Polperro, and conversations about the advantages of working in rural areas. They weren't just theoretically interested in his region. They were actively preparing to operate there. More disturbing was discovering that several local teenagers were already being discussed as potential targets. He recognized names from his school, descriptions of people he knew, references to family situations and social media activity. The users weren't just planning. They were already gathering intelligence. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as both an asset and a target hit him hard. His online activities had demonstrated his capabilities, whilst his location made him valuable for local intelligence. By exploring their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploiting curiosity. The direct contact began with a message on his Discord server. "We know you've been watching. Time to be useful." Attached was a single photo, his bedroom window, taken from outside the cottage. The message was clear. They could reach him whenever they wanted. Instead of dramatic confrontations, they offered a simple arrangement: help with basic intelligence gathering, monitoring social media, noting when people traveled, identifying vulnerable individuals, and his online activities would remain private. Refuse and his browsing history would be shared with his mum, his school, the local police. The work started small. Screenshot certain social media posts, note when families mentioned holiday plans, track the online activity of specific teenagers. Nothing that seemed directly harmful, but each task connected him deeper into their operations. Tom tried to resist, but the leverage was too strong. They'd compiled a comprehensive dossier of his dark web exploration, complete with timestamps, screenshots, and a detailed analysis of his interests. His curiosity had been weaponized against him. The psychological control was masterful. They never threatened violence, never demanded anything obviously criminal. Instead, they gradually normalized his cooperation, making each new request seem like a natural progression from the last. His moral boundaries eroded through small compromises that individually seemed manageable. One autumn evening, the power went out across the peninsula during a storm. Not the dramatic blackout of horror films, but the kind of routine outage that rural areas experience regularly. Tom's mum went to stay with a friend whose house had a generator, leaving him alone in the cottage. 2 days later, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a single slip of paper with login credentials. The drive contained access to a private forum where his username was already recognized. His handlers had decided his period of basic intelligence gathering was over. It was time for more direct involvement. The USB drive contained detailed profiles of local teenagers, complete with photos, social media analysis, and vulnerability assessments. His job was to verify the information, add local context, and identify the most promising targets. His transformation from observer to participant was complete. He spent the next several hours reading through files that contained painfully detailed information about people he'd known all his life. The profiles weren't just demographic data. They included psychological assessments, family dynamics, and exploitation strategies. Someone had invested serious effort in understanding his community. By dawn, he understood his true role in their operation. He wasn't just providing intelligence. He was helping them select victims from his own community. His local knowledge, gained through a lifetime of village life, was being used to identify which of his neighbors were most vulnerable to manipulation. The trap had been perfectly constructed. His eagerness to understand had provided the initial contact. His digital footprint had given them leverage, and his local knowledge made him indispensable. Every choice he'd made since watching that film had led him deeper into their web. The network's activities in Cornwall expanded gradually over the following months. Tom's intelligence proved accurate and valuable, enabling them to operate with confidence in an area they'd never worked before. Every few weeks, they'd remind him they still had the files, just in case he forgot. His cooperation had made their expansion possible. The guilt was overwhelming. Missing person reports, worried parents, teenagers who disappeared for days before returning changed, all traced back to information he'd provided. His questions had been transformed into complicity, his knowledge into a weapon against his own community. The authorities remained unaware of the network's activities. They investigated individual incidents without recognizing the pattern, pursued obvious suspects without understanding the sophisticated recruitment and control methods being employed. Their traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing a threat this well organized. Tom's academic performance collapsed as the psychological pressure mounted. He started keeping lists of everything he said to everyone, terrified he might forget who knew what. Teachers noticed his declining grades and withdrawal from social activities, but attributed them to typical teenage stress. The real source of his problems couldn't be discussed with anyone. The network continued to grow, not through dramatic expansion, but through careful cultivation of assets like Tom. They were building a distributed operation, using local knowledge and digital leverage to establish footholds in communities across the country. What had started as curiosity about a film had become participation in something far more sinister. The most disturbing realization was that Tom's story wasn't unique. The network's recruitment methods were systematic and repeatable, designed to convert questions into complicity. They were building a network of reluctant accomplices, each trapped by their own digital footprints and moral compromises. As I write this, Tom is still in Polperro, still providing intelligence, still carrying secrets that age him beyond his years. The boy who just wanted answers about a film has been replaced by someone who understands too much about the darkness that exists beneath the surface of normal life. The network continues to operate and expand, feeding on the natural inquisitiveness of young people who stumble across references to its activities. Each new recruit follows a similar path: initial questions, gradual involvement, eventual complicity. The cycle perpetuates itself, growing stronger with each iteration. But what haunts me most isn't Tom's story, or even the network's continued operation. It's the realization that right now, someone reading this might be wondering if such things could really exist. Someone might be inquisitive enough to start looking, to start searching, to take the first steps down a path that leads to the same destination.